Welcome to Potter Read. Today's story. Harry drew Merlin's buried staff from the lake at age 7 and awoke the magic of old Avalon. If you haven't yet, go ahead and smash that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a tale. Now, let's begin. Chapter 1. The water that remembered the holiday cottage sat where the land could not decide whether it was earth or water, and Harry Potter, who had turned 7 that morning and told no one, thought it was the strangest place he had ever been made to stand. It was called Withy End, though nothing about it seemed to end anywhere. Behind it the Somerset levels ran flat and green to the foot of a far hill, and the hill rose out of the flatness the way a whale rises out of a still sea, alone, wrong, older than the fields around it. Uncle Vernon had grumbled about the drive down and the smell of the ditches, and the fact that a man of his standing should be sent to nurse a failing depot in a county where the roads were built for carts. Aunt Petunia had scrubbed the cottage twice before she would let Dudley sit in it. And Harry had been given the box room under the stairs of a rented house, which was, he had decided on the first night, only fair because it was the same as home, and the same as home was the safest thing there was. The morning of his birthday nobody said the word birthday. That was ordinary too. Petunia set a boiled egg in front of Dudley and a second in front of Vernon and told Harry to eat his bread standing up because his hands were dirty and she would not have him at the good table. There was a card on the mantel, but it had a picture of a puppy on it, and it was for Dudley, from Marge, and inside it said many happy returns in a hand that pressed so hard it had torn the paper. Harry read it upside down while he chewed and worked out, in the careful way he worked things out, that if the card was Dudley's then no card was his, and if no card was his then the day was not to be marked, and if the day was not to be marked then, the best thing a clever person could do was be somewhere else before anyone thought to give him something to do. So when Petunia flapped her tea towel at him and said, "Get out from under my feet, go on out," he went out gladly, and that was how he came to be standing at the bottom of the garden of Withy End with the whole drowned green country in front of him and no one behind him at all. The heat lay over the levels like a hand. It was the thick, breathing heat of high summer over standing water, and it carried a smell Harry had no name for, dark and sweet and a little rotten, the smell of peat and cut willow and the black patient ditches the local men called rines. Dragonflies hung in the air over the reeds, stitched sideways, hung again. Somewhere a long way off a machine was cutting something and had been cutting it all week. Between Harry and the far hill there was nothing but grass and water and the long lines of pollarded willows, each one knuckled and swollen at the head where men had cropped it for 100 years, so that the trees stood in their rows like old people who had lost their hands and put up the stumps of their arms to feel the sun. Harry knew he was not to go far. He knew it the way he knew the number of stairs in the house on Privet Drive and the exact weight of Dudley's fist. But knowing a rule and minding it were two different animals, and there was no one to mind it for. He climbed the sagging gate at the bottom of the garden because the gate was easier than the fence, and he dropped into the field, and the grass came up past his knees and closed behind him, and Withy End with its net curtains and its washed step went quiet at his back. He walked toward the hill because the hill was the only thing worth walking toward. The field gave onto a rough drove, a green lane between two rines, and the rines were skinned over with duckweed so bright it looked like paint, and beneath the paint the water was the color of stewed tea and went down further than Harry cared to think. He kept to the middle of the drove. He had worked out already that a person who fell into a rine would not be able to climb the bank, because the bank was cut straight down and slick as soap, and a person who could not climb the bank would have to shout, and there was no one to hear a shout out here but the machine that had been cutting all week. So he kept to the middle and he watched his feet, and when a moorhen exploded out of the reeds beside him with a shriek and a clatter he stood absolutely still until his chest stopped jumping, and then he laughed at himself in the way he had, quietly so as not to be heard laughing. He crossed a plank bridge that some farmer had thrown over a rine, 2 boards and a nail, and on the far side of it the land changed. He could not have said how it changed. That was what troubled him later, when he tried to lay it out in order for himself the way he laid everything out. The grass was the same grass, the willows were the same willows. But past the plank bridge the drove narrowed and turned, and the willows stopped being cropped and began to grow as they wished, tall and leaning and gray, and among them came alders, black-barked, their feet in wet ground, and the alders grew closer together the further he went, until the sky was only a bright coin held up between the leaves. The machine stopped cutting, not paused, stopped, cut off clean, a door shut on it. And the birds which had been everywhere over the open levels, the pipits and the moorhens and the endless small brown arguments in the reeds, the birds were not here. Harry stood in the green half-dark under the alders and listened to how many of them there were not, and the listening pressed on his ears like water when you go too deep in the bath. A sensible person, he told himself, would turn round now. He was a sensible person. He had to be. There had never been anyone to be sensible on his behalf. He turned the whole thing over in his mind the way he turned over the question of whether it was safe to come out of the cupboard when the house had gone quiet, weighing the quiet, deciding what kind of quiet it was. This was not a bad quiet, that was the strange part. It was a waiting quiet, and the thing it was waiting for was not him, or not only him, and he found that he wanted, more than he had wanted anything in a long time, to see what the quiet was waiting for. So he went on, and the alders opened, and there was the mere. It lay in a hollow of the wood with the trees leaning over it all the way round, and it was black. Not dark, not brown like the Rhines with their tea-colored peat. Black, the flat blind black of a window at night when the light is on inside and you cannot see out. The willows on its far bank hung their long hair into it and did not stir, because there was no wind under the alders, there was no wind anywhere in that hollow, and the water gave back the leaning trees so exactly and so darkly that Harry could not tell for a moment where the world ended and the water began, and the not being able to tell made the ground feel untrustworthy under his shoes. Mist stood on the surface in low ropes and coils, though the day was hot and there should have been no mist, and the mist did not drift. It waited with everything else. Harry crouched at the edge of the mere on a hummock of grass and looked at the black water and felt the whole of his life go small and far behind him. Privet Drive and the cupboard and the boiled egg he had not been given, all of it thin as a picture in a book someone was holding in another room. There was something in the water. He almost missed it. It was deep and the black gave nothing up easily, and at first he took it for the pale trunk of a drowned tree lying at a slant on the bottom. But it was too straight for a tree and too long, and it did not lie the way a fallen thing lies. It stood, or nearly stood, canted against the dark like a stopped clock hand, and along its length ran a faint grain of light, pale worming of light that moved when nothing else moved, that breathed slow once and was still and breathed again. Harry knelt lower over the water with his hands flat on the wet grass and his nose almost to the surface, and the light in the deep place answered him. It brightened where he looked. When he turned his eyes away along the shaft of the thing, the brightness ran ahead of his looking, to the top of it, where the pale grain gathered into a knot, and in the knot there was set something round and dark that took the light and folded it inward and gave a little of it back, the way a held breath gives back warmth. Harry stayed very still and did his thinking. The thing was too deep to reach. That was the first fact, and he made himself hold it because he had learned that most trouble came from skipping the first fact to get to the part you wanted. It was too deep. The mere shelved away black and steep from the very edge. He could see that the bottom fell off a hand's breadth from the bank, and after that there was no bottom he could see at all, only the standing pale thing far down in the dark. If he reached, he would not reach it. If he leaned out to reach it, the bank was cut and slick like the Rhine banks, and he would go in, and the water would close its window over him, and no one would come, because the machine had stopped and the birds were gone, and no one on the whole flat earth knew he was here. That was the second fact. He was 7 years old, and he was alone at the edge of a black water with a thing in it that wanted him to come, and if he drowned, no one would even miss the egg they had not given him. He did not reach. He wanted to. It sat in him like hunger, worse than hunger, the pull of the pale grain of light in the round dark stone at the top of it, the sense that had come over him under the alders and swollen since, that the waiting quiet had been waiting a very long time and had been waiting for exactly this, for a person, this person, to kneel here at the lip of the black and put out his hand. But wanting a thing had never once in 7 years been reason enough to get it, and Harry did not reach, and the not reaching was the bravest thing he had done in his life, and no one would ever know he had done it. The water rose to meet him instead, not all of it. A single thread of the black lifted from the surface where the pale thing stood beneath, lifted and stood upright, a rope of water hanging in the still air with no hand to hold it, and inside the rope the mist gathered and turned and put on the shape of the deep thing, as though the water were showing him a drawing of what it held. And in the drawing the thing was a staff. Not a wand. Harry did not yet know what a wand was, but he knew what a wand would have been, a thin, clever stick for a conjurer at a fair, and this was not that. This was a staff as tall as a tall man, of some pale close-grained wood gone to the color of old bone in the water, worn smooth where a hand would hold it and knot it at the head into a cage of grown wood, and in the cage the round dark stone and around the whole of it, cut so deep and so long ago that the water had softened them, ran letters in a snaking line from foot to crown, letters in no alphabet Harry had ever been made to copy out, and yet he found that if he did not try to read them, if he only let his eye follow the snake of them up the shaft, they gave up their meaning the way a smell gives up a memory, all at once and from the side. "Come," said the letters without sound. "You are late. We have kept it a very long time." "I can't," Harry said out loud to the water, and his voice fell dead in the hollow with no echo. "It's too deep. I'll drown." And the black mirror, which had lain flat and blind since before there was a Somerset to be flat in, tilted the whole world toward him. That was how it felt, and how he told it to himself ever after, unable to make it truer with plainer words, that the water did not rise so much as the world leaned, the far hill and the alders and the hanging willows and the ropes of standing mist all leaning inward toward the black eye of the mere, and the black eye opening. The surface did not break, it thinned. It went from window to veil, from veil to the barest gray film over a depth that was suddenly not deep at all but near, dreadfully near, so that the pale standing staff was no longer fathoms down in the dark but just there, a hand's breadth under the film, close enough to see the grain in the wood and the letters crawling in the stone at the crown drinking the green light of the alders, and Harry understood, in the wordless sideways way he had understood the letters, that the depth had not gone anywhere. The mirror was still bottomless, the staff was still deep. The water had only folded, the way a page folds to bring two far apart words together without tearing the book, and if he reached now he would not be reaching down into black water at all but across a fold in the world, and he would not drown because the thing was here, it had come up the fold to meet his hand, and all the drowning was on the underside of the page where he need never look. He reached. He put his hand through the gray film, and the film was neither wet nor cold. It was like putting his hand through the surface of held breath, through the skin on cooling milk, through the last thin wall of sleep before waking, and on the far side of it his fingers closed around the smooth, worn wood, and it was warm. That undid him more than anything, the warmth. He had braced for the cold of deep water, and instead the staff was warm as a hand held out, warm as the flank of a sleeping animal, warm the way a house is warm when someone has been living in it, and it turned in his grip slow of its own accord, and settled its worn place against his palm as if it had been measured for him 1,000 years before his hand existed to be measured. Then Harry pulled, and the mirror gave up its long secret, and Avalon woke. He drew the staff out of the water hand over hand, and it came up longer than the mirror was deep, longer than the hollow was wide, longer, it seemed, than the whole afternoon, the pale shaft sliding endlessly up out of the black with the mist pouring off it in sheets and the letters brightening along its length one after another as they broke the surface. Until with a sound like the whole wood taking one breath after holding it for an age, the crown of the staff came free, and the stone at its head opened its light upon the world. The light was not like fire and not like the sun. It was the color that lies behind the eyelids when you press them shut in a bright room, red and gold and older than either, and it did not fall on things so much as it remembered them. And where it fell the wood of the alders remembered that it had once been a forest, and the black water remembered that it had once been a lake men crossed in boats to reach an island. And the far hill under its net of fields remembered that it had once stood up out of a shining mirror as an isle of orchards with the sun going down gold behind it, and the isle had a name, and the name came up through the light and through the water and through the soles of Harry's feet where he stood on the wet grass with the staff impossibly tall and warm in his two hands, and the name was Avalon. The mist rose. It rose off the mirror in a great slow wheel, and as it rose it took on shapes it had no right to hold, the ropes and coils becoming for a breath the tall prows of barges and the arch of a bridge no longer standing and the crowns of apple trees heavy with a fruit that had rotted to peat 1,000 years ago. All of it climbing the light, all of it turning, and through the turning mist came a brightness across the water that was a woman and was not a woman, that walked on the black film of the mirror without breaking it. Robed in the water itself so that the willows showed through her and the drowned staff light showed through her and the far hill showed through her, and she was beautiful the way deep water is beautiful, which is to say that she was also the most frightening thing Harry had ever seen, and he did not run, because running from deep water is how deep water takes you, and some part of him 7 years old and cornered knew this without being told. She came to the edge of the mirror and looked down at him, and her looking had weight like the heat, like the quiet. "A child," she said. Her voice was the sound the mirror would make if the mirror could speak, low and cold and full of drowned bells. After 1,000 years and more, a child with the sleep still in his eyes and the dust of a poor house on his shoes. So the wheel comes round again to the beginning as it began the first time, with a boy who should not have been able to do what he has done. Harry held the staff against him with both arms because it was too tall to hold any other way, and it went on being warm, and its warmth was the only thing in the whole lanning, waking, terrible afternoon that seemed to be on his side. "I'm sorry," he said, because sorry was the word that had kept him alive so far, and he offered it now out of habit, holding it up to her the way he had held up sorry to Uncle Vernon 1,000 times. "I didn't mean to take anything. I'll put it back. I only wanted to see." "You cannot put it back." She did not say it unkindly, she said it the way the tide says it. "It has been waiting for a hand, and it has found one, and it does not know how to want another. Do you feel how warm it is?" "Yes," Harry whispered. "It is warm because you are the first living thing to hold it since the last hand that held it went cold. It knew that hand as it now knows yours. It is the same hand, child. It's come back to itself after a long time in the dark, and it does not care that the face above the hand is small and frightened and does not understand. Blood does not care about faces." The woman of the water bent nearer, and the willows in the hill and the red gold light bent with her, showing through her, and Harry saw that where her eyes should have been there were two places where the light of the stone went down and did not come back, two little mirrors of her own. "Do you know your name, Harry?" said Harry. "Harry Potter, that is a name they gave you," she said. "It is a true name and you should keep it. There is more in it than they knew when they laid it on you, but it is not the name in the water. The name in the water is older, and the wood knows it, and the stone knows it, and I have kept it here on my tongue through all the drowned years, waiting for a hand warm enough to give it back to. She straightened, and the whole hollow straightened with her, and she spoke the name out over the black mirror and the waking mist and the impossible tall staff and the 7-year-old holding it, and the name went into Harry like the warmth had gone into his palm, from the outside straight to a place he had not known was there and had always been empty. Imrise, she said. You are of the blood of Imrise, who men in their small time called Merlin, and this is his staff, and you have drawn it from the deep, and in the drawing of it you have set your hand to the last thread that held old Avalon under the water and pulled, and the thread has come loose in your fingers, and you cannot put that back either. Far away and all at once, and in more places than a person could count, things that had slept since Harry's grandfathers were young, turned over in their sleep, and began the slow business of waking. In a round office high in a castle in the north, a spindle-legged silver instrument that had spun the same patient way for 100 years stopped, and shivered and spun the other way, and let out a thread of smoke the color of the light behind closed eyes. And a phoenix on a golden perch lifted its head from its wing, and sang one note that had not been sung in Britain since the island was another island, and would not say why. Under a bank on the flat levels, an ash tree that had been a staff before it was a tree, planted head down by a hand now 300 years in the churchyard, put out a single green leaf in the last hot week of July, against all the law of trees. Deep beneath a city, in vaults cut so far down that the goblins who cut them had needed a new word for down, a stone that had been set into a wall as a mark and a promise before the wall or the city or the word were dreamed of, a stone that no living goblin had been taught the meaning of because the meaning had been thought safely dead, warmed under the hand of a passing loremaster, and hummed once the note the phoenix had sung. So that the loremaster snatched his hand back and stood very still in the dark, and understood that his whole long life had just become the least important part of his life. And under the black mirror in the drowned country beneath the fold in the world, where the staff had lain and where worse things than the staff had been laid down and pressed flat and told to keep still, something with a crown of weed in its dead hair opened one eye at the coming of the red gold light, and found that it could move a finger and moved it, and began, with the terrible patience of the very old and the very wronged, to remember how to stand. Harry knew none of this. He knew only that the woman of the water had gone quiet again and gone thinner as she spoke, the willows and the hill showing more and more through her until she was hardly there, and that the red gold light was drawing back into the stone at the crown of the staff, folding itself away as the water had folded, and that the mirror below him was going from veil back to window, sealing its secret, taking back its false shallowness so that the depth returned and the bottomlessness returned, and the far pale place where the staff had lain was black and empty now, because the staff was here in his arms and it was his and he could not put it back. They will come for it, the woman said, and her voice was the last of her, a ring of cold bells fading down into the mirror. Some to keep it from you, thinking it too great for a child. Some to take it for themselves, thinking a child too small to keep it. One at least who loves you in the way that the keeper of a cage loves the bird, and will do you the most harm of all, because his harm will wear a kind face and call itself your good. And one who has waited under the water longer than the staff and colder and hates the light you have let in. You are 7 years old, Imrise, and you have woken 1,000 years, and I cannot make you ready, for there is no making a child ready for this. I can only tell you the one thing the staff will never tell you, because the staff does not know it. It is yours because you drew it, not because they say so, not because I say so, not even because the blood says so, because your hand and no other reached across the fold and did not let go. Remember that when the kind face tells you otherwise. And she was gone back into the black, the way reflection goes when the lamp is carried out of the room, and the mist sank, and the birds began again over the open levels a long way off, one and then a dozen and then all of them at once, arguing in the reeds over nothing at all, and the machine that cut things started up in the hot afternoon and cut, and Harry Potter stood alone at the edge of an ordinary black pond in an ordinary wet wood on the flat land under the hill, holding a staff taller than a man, 7 years old, with a name in him that had not been there that morning and could not be got out. For a while he did not do anything at all, because there was nothing his body knew how to do that was equal to it. He stood, and the staff stood warm against him, and he watched the water settle and go dull, an ordinary pond that a farmer might water beasts at, and he waited, with a patience learned in a cupboard, for the world to turn back into the world he understood. It did not entirely oblige, but the panic that had stood ready at his shoulder the whole time, waiting to take him, did not come down on him either, and after a while he understood why, and understanding it was like finding a step in the dark exactly where his foot had hoped it would be. He was not frightened of the staff. Everything else in that hollow had frightened him, the leaning world and the thinning woman and the drowned bells and the eye of light in the stone. But the staff itself, warm in his arms, asked nothing of him and threatened nothing, and only leaned its weight into him, the way Mrs. Fig's oldest cat used to lean its weight into him on the days she left him alone in her cabbage-smelling front room, the way a thing lanes that has decided you will do. He sat down then because his legs had begun to shake in the loose, distant way legs shake after they have carried you through something they did not agree to, and he sat on the hummock of grass with the staff across his knees and looked at his own hands holding it. They were the same hands. That was the thing he kept coming back to, turning them over palm and back, the bitten nails and the scab on the left knuckle where Dudley's ring had caught him. Ordinary hands, a boy's hands, small enough that both of them together did not close all the way round the pale shaft. He had thought, in the way a person thinks such things without ever quite saying them, that if magic were real it would come to a child differently, would announce itself, would make his hands into something other than the chapped and biscuit-stealing hands he knew. But the hands were the same, and the staff had come to them anyway, and there was a lesson in that he could not yet unfold, something about how the door to the enormous is always fitted to the size of whoever happens to be standing at it. He pressed his thumb to the worn place in the wood where a great hand had once worn it, and his thumb sat in the hollow that the great hand had left, and the hollow did not shrink to fit him and he did not grow to fill it. They simply agreed, his thumb and the old deep hollow, to share the space for now. "All right," Harry said to it, quietly so as not to be heard, though there was no one in a mile to hear. "All right, but I can't carry you home like this. You're too big. They'll see you and Uncle Vernon will put you on the fire, and then where will we be?" He had reasoned himself without noticing the moment of it, out of asking whether a staff could hear him and into the far more useful question of what to do about a staff that could. That was Harry all over, and it was the thing about himself he trusted most, that when the world went strange, some cold, clear part of him stopped being amazed a beat before everyone else would have, and started counting exits. He looked at the staff, taller than he was by half again, pale and warm and impossible, and he thought about the box room and the net curtains and Petunia's eyes going everywhere, and he laid out the problem the way he laid out all his problems, in a line, first fact first. The first fact was that he could not hide a 6-foot staff. The second fact was that the staff did not seem to think of itself as a 6-foot staff, or as any fixed thing at all. It had come up out of the water longer than the water was deep. It had shown itself to him first as a drawing in a rope of mist. It had folded a bottomless mirror into a hand's breadth to bring itself to his palm. A thing that could do all that, Harry reasoned, holding the reasoning carefully because it was the most important reasoning of his life, was not really 6 feet long the way the gatepost was 6 feet long. It was 6 feet long the way he was in the cupboard, because that was where it was being kept, and being kept somewhere was not the same as being that size forever. "You can be smaller," he told it. He did not command it. He had never in his life had the standing to command anything, and he did not try now. He only said it the way you say a true thing to a friend who has forgotten it, gently and with complete certainty. "You can be small enough to hide. I know you can. You made the pond shallow. Being small is easier than that." The staff grew warm against his arms, warmer, until it was almost too warm to hold, and the letters along its shaft brightened once, up its whole length, the sideways meaning of them washing over him without sound, and this time the meaning was not "come" and was not "you are late." This time it was something more like laughter, if laughter could be 1,000 years old and pleased and a little proud, laughter at being spoken to plainly by a warm small hand after an age of dark and silence, and then the staff in his arms drew itself in. It did not shrink the way a thing shrinks in a story, evenly and all over. It folded the way the water had folded, the way the woman had folded into the black. It gathered its impossible length inward along some seam that Harry could feel but not see, the head coming down and the foot coming up and the whole warm mass of it drawing together between his hands until he was holding not a staff at all but a wand, a foot of pale bone-colored wood worn smooth in the middle where a great hand had once worn it smooth, and at one end a knot of grown wood no bigger than a walnut, and in the knot, small and dark and folding the green light of the alders inward and giving a little of it back, the stone. Harry turned it over in his fingers. It was still warm. It was still, he understood, exactly as long as it had ever been, 6 feet in 1,000 years and the whole depth of a bottomless mere. It had only decided because he had asked it to keep most of that length somewhere else for now, on the underside of the page where it kept the drowning. Held in his 2 hands, the little wand of it weighed no more than a pencil, and about as much as the whole rest of his life put together. He put it up his sleeve, along the inside of his forearm, the way he had learned to carry the odd biscuit out of Petunia's kitchen, so that his hand looked empty and his arm did the smuggling. It fit the length of his forearm, snug against the bone, neater than any biscuit ever had. Then he pulled his cuff down over the end of it and looked at his own hand, and his hand looked like the hand of a boy who had gone for a walk and found nothing, which was exactly what he needed it to look like. He walked back the way he had come. The alders let him out. The plank bridge was where he had left it, 2 boards and a nail. The willows put their cropped stumps up to the sun in their long rows. and the moorhen he had frightened, or its cousin, went off across a Rhine with its comic legs trailing, and the far hill stood up out of the flat land under its net of fields and did not to look at, remember anything at all. But the drove seemed shorter going back than it had coming out, and the light over the levels had turned from the white hammer of noon to the long amber of late afternoon without asking his permission. The land had changed while his back was turned, and Harry noticed it in the small way he noticed everything, by keeping a list. The rinds he had kept so carefully to the middle of were greener along their edges than they had been at noon, the duckweed thickening even as he passed, and here and there a bank that had been bare mud when he crossed it wore now a fringe of new watercress, glistening, uncurling, the whole drowned country breathing out through every green thing that could hold water. A willow he passed, one of the knuckled old pollards with its arms cropped short, had put out a spray of long yellow withies from the very top of its stump, this year's growth grown overnight to the length of a summer, and Harry stopped under it and looked up at the impossible new wands of it against the amber sky, and understood that this was his doing, or the staff's doing, or the waking's, and that it would go on being their doing whether he watched it or not. He went on before anyone could come and ask him why the tree had grown. When he came at last over the sagging gate into the garden of Withy End, he could hear, through the open kitchen window, Aunt Petunia's voice pitched high in the register she kept for grievances, wondering aloud and at length where that boy had got to, and whether he had been at the bins, and what the neighbors would think, though there were no neighbors for a mile and the nearest of them a heron. Harry stopped with one leg over the gate and the wand warm against the inside of his arm and looked at the back of the rented house, the wash step and the net curtains and the square window of the box room where he was to sleep, and he did a piece of arithmetic he had done every day of his rememberable life, working out what face to wear and what story to tell and how to become, between the garden and the door, a boy so unremarkable that the eye slid off him. He had it down to a craft. He could make himself boring the way other children could whistle, but the arithmetic came out wrong this time, or rather it came out with a new number in it that he had never had to carry before, and the number was the wand and what the woman of the water had said and the name that had gone into the empty place and settled there and begun very quietly to be at home. They will come for it, she had said, some to keep it from you, some to take it, one who loves you like the keeper of a cage. And one under the water, colder than the staff, who hates the light. Harry did not know who any of them were. He was 7, and until that morning the largest force in his universe had been his uncle's temper, and he had no way to measure the size of what had just walked into his life against the size of anything else, no scale that ran that high. But he had spent every one of his 7 years being small in a house that wanted him smaller, and he knew, better than he knew his letters, better than he knew the number of stairs, what it was to have a thing that was yours and to have to keep it from people who would take it because they were bigger. He knew the whole science of that. He had a wand's worth of practice in it, if the practice had only ever been over biscuits and a torn library ticket, and a soldier of Dudley's he had once hidden for a week just to know that he could. They can come, he said under his breath over the gate to no one, to the heron, to the warm wood against his arm, but they don't get it, it's mine, I reached and I didn't let go. He said it exactly as the woman had said it, without knowing he was going to, and inside his sleeve the stone in the little wand warmed against his skin, and folded the last of the amber light inward and held it there, keeping it, the way it kept everything, on the far side of the page where the drowning was, saving it up against the dark that had, 1,000 years down and a county wide and a whole world over, already begun so patiently to stand. Petunia's voice cracked out again over the garden, sharper. Harry climbed the rest of the way over the gate, put on his boring face like a coat, and went in to be shouted at, 7 years old, carrying Merlin's staff up his sleeve and the waking of Avalon in his chest on the evening of a birthday no one had wished him. Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. The keeper of the moor, the box room at Withy End, had a window the size of a hymn book, and through it on the first night the wand showed Harry the whole of a drowned country. He had not asked it to. He had gone to bed as he always did, folded small under a blanket that smelled of somebody else's holidays, with the wand laid along the inside of his forearm, because he could not think of anywhere in a rented house that would be safer than his own skin. Downstairs the television murmured and Uncle Vernon laughed his 3-note laugh at something, and a moth beat itself stupid against the shade of the landing light, and Harry lay in the dark and tried to make the day fit inside his head, and could not because the day was bigger than his head. The day had a mirror in it, and a woman made of water, and a name that was still ringing in him like a struck glass. Then his eyes closed, and the wand warmed once against his arm, and he was not asleep, and he was not awake. He was somewhere behind his own eyes where the stone at the crown of the staff had gone to keep its light, and the light unfolded, and he saw. He saw the mirror as it had been. Not a black pond in an alder car, but a wide, bright water under a sky washed clean by rain, and out of the water an island, and on the island orchards going up in green terraces to hall of grey stone, and around the island the mist standing like walls, so that a person crossing to it in one of the low barges would pass out of the ordinary rainy world of hills, and into a place the mist had agreed to keep. He saw the apple trees, more apple trees than a person could count, some in blossom and some in fruit on the same branch in the same hour, because the isle did not hold to the ordinary law that says a tree may do one thing at a time. He saw a heron stand in the shallows and not move for 100 years. He saw coming down through the orchards with a staff in his hand, a figure he knew before he could see its face, knew by the warmth that ran up his own arm in his sleep, and the figure was tall and grey-cloaked and old and not old, and the staff in its hand was the staff, unbowed, uncracked, its stone alight, and where the figure set the foot of the staff to the turf remembered how to be green, and Harry understood that he was being shown not a story but a debt. The way you are shown a photograph of a grandfather you never met and told, quietly, this is where your chin comes from, and he saw more of the isle than a waking mind could have held and kept its shape. He saw the causeway of the dead laid across the water in white stone, and the barges going out along it under sails the color of the inside of a shell, carrying who knew what to who knew where, poled by figures that did not cast reflections. He saw that on Avalon the hours did not run in a line as they ran at withy end, one after another like beads on a string, but stood together in a single deep pool, so that a woman filling a jar at a well in the morning was still filling it at dusk and had already carried it home, all at once, and none of it was strange there, and all of it was strange to Harry, and the strangeness poured into him and did not drown him, because the light held him up. He understood without being told that this was what Imrise had made or found and held open, not a trick and not a treasure, but a whole other way for a place to be, a country that had stepped a single pace out of the world's marching line and stood still in the green, and that when it went under the water it had not been destroyed, only closed, folded shut, and pressed flat under the deepest of the 9 meres like a flower in a book, waiting the way the staff waited, waiting for a hand. The gray figure stopped in the vision and turned, though there was no one behind it to turn to, and looked up out of the drowned bright country straight at Harry in his blanket in the dark, and did not speak, because the dead do not have much breath to spend, but it lifted the staff a hand's width off the turf and set it down again once, and the sound of it going down came all the way up the 1,000 years and the fold in the world and into the box room, a low soft knock. And the moth on the landing stopped beating, and the television downstairs hiccuped into silence for the length of one held breath, and then went on. Harry opened his eyes. The wand was warm. Above him the ceiling of the box room had bloomed in the dark, with a faint pale grain of light that ran in a snaking line from the corner over the door to the corner over the window, the same letters that had crawled up the staff in the mirror, written now in cold fire across a rented ceiling, and as he watched they gave up their meaning from the side the way they did, and the meaning was not come this time and was not you are late. The meaning was, I remember for you, you need only carry. Then the light drew back into the wand, and the ceiling was a ceiling, and Harry lay in the dark and did the only thing that made any sense, which was to whisper thank you to a foot of pale wood, because his aunt had raised him to say thank you for things, even things she gave him grudgingly, and this was the first thing in his memory he had ever been given gladly. He slept after that and did not dream, and woke to the smell of Uncle Vernon's bacon and the sound of Dudley wanting more of it. In the morning the small magics started. They were not large enough for anyone but Harry to notice, and Harry noticed everything. It was how he had stayed alive. The tap over the kitchen sink, when Petunia sent him to fill the kettle, ran warm and then hot and then almost scalding under his hand, though the boiler had not been lit, and cooled the instant he stopped wanting it to be warm. A dead geranium on the windowsill of the box room, brown and folded in its pot since before the Dursleys had rented the place, put out one green shoot in the night, and Harry pinched the shoot off and buried it in the bin under the potato peelings, because a dead thing coming back to life was exactly the kind of miracle that got a person noticed, and being noticed was the one luxury he had never been able to afford. When Dudley, bored and enormous in the doorway, drew back a fist to remind Harry of the pecking order, as he did most mornings, the wand along Harry's arm went cold, not warm, cold as the mirror, and Dudley's fist stopped a foot from Harry's shoulder and would not come the rest of the way, and Dudley looked at his own arm as though it had been lent to a stranger, and went off to complain to his mother that Harry was doing something, though he could not say what. Harry sat on the back step in the sun with a heel of bread he had taken without asking, and considered all of this in order, first fact first, because a person who did not put things in order got eaten. The first fact was that the wand did things whether he asked or not. That was a problem, because a thing that acted on its own would eventually act where someone could see, and then the fire, and then the questions, and then whatever came after the questions, which in Harry's experience was always worse than the questions. The second fact was that the wand did things more when he wanted them and less when he did not, which meant the wanting was a kind of steering, and a thing that could be steered could be kept quiet if he learned the steering well enough. He had learned harder crafts than that. He had learned to be invisible in a house of 3 people who wished him gone. He could learn to hold a wand quiet. The third fact, which he did not put into words because it was not the kind of thing that went into words, was that he did not want to hold it quiet, not really, not all the way down. that some part of him wanted to run to the middle of the drove and lift his arms and let the whole drowned country go green and bright and impossible, and that this wanting was the most dangerous thing about the whole business, more dangerous than the fire because it was his own. He was still sitting with the bread and the three facts when he saw the woman watching him from the far side of the Rhine. She was old and brown and folded, rather like the geranium had been, in a coat that had been a man's coat once and a good one, tied at the middle with what looked like garden twine. She had a basket over one arm and a stick in the other hand, a plain blackthorn walking stick with a horn handle, and she was standing perfectly still in the reeds on the far bank where the drove ran on toward the tor, and she was looking at Harry and she had been looking at him. He understood, for some while, in the patient way you look at a bird you do not want to startle off a feeder. When she saw that he had seen her, she did not pretend she had been doing anything else. She lifted the blackthorn stick a hand's width off the ground and set it down again once on the turf of the far bank. Harry knew that knock. He had heard it come up 1,000 years the night before. "You'll be the one then," the woman called across the Rhine, in a voice like the creak of a gate that has been oiled but remembers being rusty. "The one that pulled the plug out of the ninefold. I felt it go. Everything on the moor felt it go. My kettle boiled itself dry and my hens laid double and the old ash by my gate put out a leaf, and I said to myself, Morwen, somebody has been at the water that ought to have known better, and here's you, a scrap of a thing eating your bread on a step, and it was you all along." "I didn't mean to do anything," Harry said, which was true and useless and the thing he always said. "No," said Morwen, "they never do." She came along her bank to where a plank crossed the Rhine, the same kind of plank as the one Harry had crossed the day before, 2 boards and a nail, and she came over it without hurry and stood in front of him in the sun, smelling of wood smoke and crushed green leaves and old wet wool, and she looked down at him out of a face with more lines in it than the moor had rinds, and her eyes were the pale washed blue of a working sky, and they went, without any fuss, straight to his forearm where the cuff came down over the wand. "Show me," she said, "not out here, come in out of the sky. There's watchers in a sky this near the tor and more of them since yesterday. Come and have something hot and let an old woman see what 1,000 years looks like when it's small enough to go up a boy's sleeve." Harry did not go with strangers. It was one of the few of Aunt Petunia's rules he had kept even after he stopped believing she made rules for his good. But the wand along his arm had gone warm at the old woman's coming, warm and easy, the warmth that kept for the staff-light and the greening and the good, cool for danger and warm for safe, and Harry had already decided in the cold, clear part of him that a wand that had drowned worse things than Dudley knew more about danger than he did. He got up off the step. He looked back once at the net curtains of Withy End, where no one was watching because no one ever watched where he went, and he followed Morwen along the drove toward the tor, and the reeds closed behind them. Her cottage was where the moor stopped being anyone's field and started being only itself, a low place of grey lias stone with a roof that sagged in the middle like an old horse, half sunk into a bank so that from behind it was hardly a house at all, only a door and a chimney and a green mound. Inside it was one room and a scullery, dark after the sun, warm with a fire that burned though it was July, and hung about with more bunches of drying green than Harry had names for, and a cat the color of peat asleep in the one good chair. Morwen put the kettle on the fire without asking it to boil, and it boiled, and she made tea the color of the Rhines and cut bread from a round brown loaf and spread it thick with butter and thicker with honey and put it in front of Harry without a word about his dirty hands, and Harry, who had eaten his bread standing up in a good kitchen the morning before, ate it sitting down in a poor one, and could not for a moment work out why his eyes had gone hot, and put it down to the fire. "Now," said Morwen when he had eaten, "show me." He drew the wand out of his sleeve and laid it on the scrubbed table between them, and the whole low room changed. The drying green on the beams stirred though there was no wind. The peat-colored cat opened one eye. And Morwen, who had felt the ninefold empty from a mile off and had come looking for a boy without flinching, went still in her chair and put both her old brown hands flat on the table on either side of the wand and did not touch it and looked at it, and when she spoke again the creak had gone out of her voice and left something older underneath. "So," she said, "there it is. The staff of him rise that they sank in the ninefold when the isle went under, and set me in mind to keep the water over it till the blood came back. 900 years and more my people have kept this moor, child, and none of us knew we were keeping it for a day, because none of us thought the day would come. Keepers get like that. You keep a thing so long you forget it's a keeping and start to think it's just the weather." She sat back. The cat closed its eye. "Well, the day's come. And it's come as a boy in his cousin's cast-offs who says he didn't mean to. That's about right. That's exactly how they said it would come if it came at all, and I never believed the saying till now." "Who said?" Harry asked. He had a great many questions, and he had learned to ask them one at a time, the smallest first, because grown-ups gave more when you did not frighten them with the size of what you wanted. "Who are your people? What's a keeper? What's the ninefold? Why me?" "That's 4, said Morwen and poured more tea, and Harry saw that she was not going to be frightened by the size of anything, which made her the first grown-up he had ever met of whom that was true. "I'll take them backwards, for they answer best that way." She told him then, and Harry listened with the whole of himself, sitting forward with his elbows on the scrubbed table and his chin in his hands, because listening well was another craft he had, and this was the first story anyone had ever told him that was worth the craft. "Why you?" she said. "Because of the blood, and I'll come to the blood. The ninefold is the water you emptied, the black mere and the alders. It has a older name than mere. It is one of 9 that were the last of the great water that stood round the isle before men came with their spades and their engines, and drained the whole of this country dry for grazing, all but the 9 which would not drain because they were not only water. This one was the deepest. This one they kept the deepest things in. A keeper is what I am and what my mother was and her mother back and back. A person set on the moor to watch the 9 and speak to no one about it, and above all to see that the water stayed over what was sunk in it. And we did that, child, we did it so long and so quiet that we forgot we were doing it, and a good keeping is a forgotten keeping, so that was no shame. And my people are the last thin end of a thing that was once great, the folk of the isle, the ones who did not go under the water when Avalon went under, but stayed behind on the drowned edge of it to keep the door, and thinned and married farmers, and lost the magic out of the blood a drop a year till there was nothing left in me but the knowing, no power, only the knowing, which is why I could feel the ninefold empty and could not have stopped you if I'd wanted to." She looked at him. "You've the other half of what I've got, you've the power and none of the knowing. That's a dangerous shape for a child to be, all engine and no map." "You could be the map," Harry said before he had decided to say it, and then wished he had not, because wanting a thing out loud was how you lost it. But Morwen did not laugh or scold or say "we'll see," which was the grown-up way of saying no. She looked at him for a while over the top of her tea, and the fire ticked, and outside a curlew went over the moor crying its long bubbling cry that is the loneliest sound in England, and at last she said, "I could try, God help the both of us, I could try." Then she told him about Merlin and about the blood. Imrise was his name, she said, the true one, the one the water knows. Merlin is what the storymen made of it later when they'd forgotten the maker and kept the marvel. He was the greatest of the old British magic, which is a different magic from the wand and Latin trade they teach up at their school in the north, older and wetter and closer to the ground, the magic of the isle before ever a Roman set his boot on it. He made Avalon, or he did not make it so much as he found the seam in the world where it could be and held the seam open, the fold, you understand, the place where the mist agrees to keep a country the ordinary world can't reach. He kept it open all his life with that staff there on my table, and when he came to die he did the one thing the storyman got right and 100 things they got wrong. He laid himself down to sleep, not dead, sleeping under the deepest of the 9, and he had the isle folded shut behind him and the water drawn up over the door, and the last of his people, mine, set to keep it, against the day the blood should thin so far in the wide world that it needed calling home. And he sank the staff in the water on top of his sleep, for a lock and a key both, and he said, they say, the words my grandmother said to me and I never thought I'd say to a living soul, it will know the hand. It went under, child, in the year the storyman calls something and the water calls the year the light went out, and it lay in the black 900 years and more, and it knew no hand because no hand came, because the blood was scattered so thin and so far that it forgot it was blood at all. "And I'm the blood," Harry said. "You're the blood," Morwen agreed. "Come down through more branches than I could count, and most of them not knowing what they carried, the way a river carries gold and never spends it. Down through the folk that went east when the isle closed and married and were called this and that, and one line of them, somewhere back of you, was called Peveril, and after that Potter, and there you sit. Imrise's blood in a boy who says sorry to gateposts. It doesn't run strong in you, mind. It ran near dry, but near dry is not dry, and the staff needed only a spark to know its own, and you had the spark, and you put your hand in the water, and it knew you the moment it touched you, the same hand, it thinks, because to a thing that old the difference between the first hand and the last is nothing, a single day with a long dark night in the middle of it." She reached out at last and with one brown finger touched the wand where it lay, very lightly, and drew the finger back and looked at the tip of it as if it had been warmed. "The same hand," she said again, softer. "Poor old thing. Waited 1,000 years to be picked up and got a 7-year-old. And the 7-year-old is exactly right, and that's the marvel of it, that's the whole marvel, that it's always exactly right and never what anyone would have chosen." She got up then with a hand on the table to lever the years off her, and went to a shelf in the dark of the scullery and came back with a box, a plain black box the length of her forearm, and she set it down and unlocked it not with a key but with a word Harry did not catch and could not have repeated, and out of it, wrapped in a square of red felt gone pink at the folds with age, she took a disc of dark metal the size of a saucer and laid it on the felt in front of him. "There's one thing more you should see before we go to the water," she said, "for it belongs to what's coming, not to what's gone. Keepers were never left to keep the ninefold alone. Look at it, don't touch it yet, it doesn't like a stranger's skin." Harry looked, the disc was not smooth. It was worked all over, edge to edge, in a fineness of line that made the letters on the staff look rough, a knotwork of channels and cells so small and so exact that the red gold light of the fire ran along them and pooled and forked and would not sit still. and in the middle of it raised was the shape of the staff, and around the staff a ring of the same crawling letters, and around that a second ring in a squarer, harder hand, angular, all corners, a writing that had never been near a willow in its life. Goblin work, said Morwen, and there was respect in the word and something warier than respect. The inner ring is ours, the old British hand, the water's own letters. The outer ring is theirs, the deep folk, the ones under the city that keep the gold and keep the grudges and forget nothing, not in 1,000 years, not in 10. When Emrys set the stone into the head of that staff, he did not cut the setting himself. There is no wizard living or dead could cut a setting to hold a thing like that stone. He went down to the deep folk and he asked, and they made him the cradle the stone sits in to this day, and in the making of it they and he swore a covenant, blood of the isle and craft of the deep, that the work would hold and the debt would stand, and that when the staff woke and the blood came home, the deep folk would know it in the same hour I knew it, by this. She touched the disk with one finger lightly, and the light in its channels leapt to meet her and then sank. A twin of this hangs in the deepest of their vaults, and when the ninefold emptied yesterday, child, mine grew warm in that box for the first time in 900 years, and I promise you theirs did the same, a mile down under a city 2 counties off, and there is a goblin somewhere this morning standing very still in the dark, exactly as I stood, working out that his whole long life has just become the smallest part of it. Harry looked at the disk and at the 2 rings of writing, the wet old letters and the hard-cornered ones, and he understood in the cold, clear part of him that the woman with the maps in the sky was not the only sort of visitor a boy might expect. Are they friends? He asked. The deep folk, yours, I mean, ours. They're neither friend nor enemy, and don't you ever let one hear you call them either, said Morwen, for both are an insult to a goblin who deals in neither, only in debt and craft and the exact keeping of a bargain. But there's a covenant with your blood cut in their oldest law, and a goblin will die before he breaks a covenant, because a covenant is the only thing a goblin holds holier than gold. That's worth more to you than a friend if you can learn to speak to them, and it's worth nothing at all if you can't, and you're 7, and you say sorry to gateposts, so we have, as they say, a deal of work in front of us. She wrapped the disk back in its pinking felt and shut it in the box and shut the box with another word. Now, where was I, you wanted to know if he's still down there? Harry looked at the wand on the table, pale and worn and warm, and thought about the gray figure in the orchard lifting the staff and setting it down, and the low knock coming up 1,000 years, and I remember for you, you need only carry, written in cold fire on a rented ceiling. Is he still down there? He asked, sleeping, and rise if I let the water out. Morwen's face did a thing then that Harry knew well, because he had watched 100 grown-ups do it when he asked the question under the question. She went carefully blank, the way a person goes blank when the true answer is one they would rather not give a child. Some of what's down there is sleeping, she said. Some of it was put down to sleep, and some of it was put down to be kept, and they are not the same, child, and you've loosed the water off the both of them at once, because that's how it was made, all one lock. There's the light under the ninefold, and I'll not lie to you, the light is the better part, the isle and the orchards and the old kind magic in him, but there's a cold under there as well. There's a thing was drowned in that water on purpose and not to sleep. She stopped, she looked into the fire. The curlew cried again out on the moor. That's a story for a fuller belly and a brighter hour. Eat another bit of bread. And then if you're set on it, and I can see that you are, we'll go down to the water, and I'll show you the first of the old arts, the smallest and the safest, and you'll do it wrong, and that's how you'll learn it's real. They went down to the water in the middle of the afternoon, when the sky over the moor was high and empty and the heat lay on the reeds, and Morwen walked ahead with her blackthorn stick and her basket and named things as she went, not lecturing, only naming, the way a person names the rooms of a house they have lived in all their life. Bog myrtle, she said, brushing it so the smell came up sharp and clean. That's for keeping the midges off and the dreams true. Meadowsweet, that's for the ache in an old woman's knees and for sweetening a floor at a wedding. Alder, never burn it green, it bleeds like a man, the old folk wouldn't cut it without asking. Willow, that's the moor's own tree, that's what withy means, and there's not a basket nor a hurdle nor an ill trap on this whole level that isn't willow, and there's not a keeper's staff either, look at mine, blackthorn for the guarding but willow for the working always. She talked and Harry listened, and the wand lay warm along his arm, and by the time the alders closed over them and the drove ran down into the green half-dark and the birds fell silent, Harry found that he was not frightened of the hush anymore, because he had a name for it now. It was the isle breathing under the door, and a thing you have a name for is a thing that has become, however slightly, yours. The mere lay black and blind in its hollow, an ordinary pond giving back the leaning trees. Morwen stopped at the edge of it and leaned on her stick and looked at the black water for a while without speaking, and her old face was doing something private that Harry had the manners not to watch. 900 years, she said to the water, not to him, and you never so much as rippled for me, for all I sat here and talked to you like a fool. And along comes the blood and you tip the whole world over to put yourself in his hand. She sniffed. Well, that's keepers for you. We do the work and the marvels go to the young. She turned to Harry and the creak came back into her voice and with it the warmth. Right, out with it. On the grass there where you can't fall in, for I'll not fish you out. I'm too old and you're not worth the wet. Now, the first art, watch my hands and don't try yet, you'll only frighten it. She crouched slow with her knees complaining, and she held one brown hand flat and low over the surface of the black water, not touching it. A hand's breadth above, and she was quiet, and Harry watched, and under her open palm the black water gathered itself without a wind into a low round mound, a blister of water standing up out of the flat, trembling, holding the size of an apple, and it rose to meet her palm and stopped short of it, quivering, and hung there. And Morwen breathed out through her teeth and let her hand rise, and the mound of water followed it up into the air, a fist of the mirror lifted clean off itself and hanging, dark and shining, a foot above the surface, obeying an old woman's palm. That's the calling, she said, holding it there, her arm beginning to shake with the age in it. The very first of it, not making. We can't make, none of us, not even him could make, only God makes, we call. There's a wanting in everything, child, in the water to be lifted, and in the seed to be green, and in the fire to be bigger, and the old art is only the asking of that wanting out loud in the right voice. The water wants to rise. It's wanted to rise since the world began, and gravity's been sitting on it saying no. All I've done is agree with it louder than gravity does. She let her hand sink, and the fist of water sank with it and rejoined the mirror without a splash, and she sat back on her heels and rubbed her arm. That's near the whole of my strength, that apple of water, and it cost me a night's sleep in the shoulder. You'll do better, you'll do worse first, and then better than I ever dreamed of, and that's the sorrow and the glory of standing where I'm standing. Go on, your turn, ask the water to rise. And mind, child, ask, don't order. It's older than you and it's older than me, and it drowned a king once, ask it nicely. Harry knelt on the grass at the lip of the black water and held out his hand. He knew already in the cold, clear part of him why she had said he would do it wrong, and he thought he knew how to do it less wrong than she expected, and he turned the whole of it over quickly while his hand hung over the mirror, laying it out first fact first. The first fact was that Morwen called with her strength, and her strength was near gone, so for her it was a labor, a lifting. The second fact was that he had no strength worth the name either, no more knowing than a spark, so if he tried to lift as she lifted, he would fail as she had promised. The third fact, the one that mattered, was that the wand along his arm had not lifted the mirror yesterday by strength. It had folded the mirror, had agreed with the water so hugely and so easily that a bottomless deep had become a hand's breadth, and it had done it not by pushing but by knowing the water's own wanting better than the water did. So the trick, Harry thought, holding his breath, was not to be strong. It was to want exactly and only what the water wanted, and to want it so simply and so cleanly that there was no daylight between his wanting and the water's, and then the rising would not be work at all, because there would be no one there to do the work, only one wanting on both sides of the surface. He did not order it. He thought of the mound of water under Morwen's palm, and he did not think lift. He thought, as gently as he had ever thought anything, come up, I'll hold you, the way he might have said it to a frightened animal, or the way, once or twice in his life, an adult had almost said it to him. The black water under his hand did not make a mound, it made a tree. It came up not in a fist, but in a fine, bright branching thread, a stem of standing water that split and split again as it rose. A whole small silver tree of water growing up out of the mirror in the space of a breath, branch and twig and the ghost of a leaf, 10 times the height of Morwen's trembling apple, and 100 times more than a spark of blood had any business calling, and it stood in the still air over the black mirror, shining and impossible and alive. And every branch of it was full of the red gold light that lived under the water, so that Harry knelt at the edge of the ninefold with a tree of lit water growing out of his want, and did not know he had stopped breathing until Morwen's hand closed hard on his shoulder. Enough, she said, and her voice had gone thin and urgent, all the creek scoured out of it. Enough, child, let it go gently, gently, don't drop it, set it down, that's it, ask it down the same as you asked it up. And Harry, shaking, unwound the wanting as carefully as he had wound it, thought, thank you, you can rest now, and the tree of water folded back down its own branches, twig into twig and branch into stem, and sank into the black and was gone, and the mirror lay flat and blind again, with no sign that anything had ever grown there, and the birds, far off, went on with their arguments. Morwen took her hand off his shoulder. She sat back on the grass, an old woman with her legs stuck out in front of her, and she looked at the water and then at Harry and then at the water again, and she was quiet for a long moment, and the thing on her face was not fear, though it was next door to fear. It was the look a person wears at the edge of something too large to hold, the naked kind that does not know to hide itself, and Harry saw it and understood that he had frightened her, not the way Dudley frightened people, but the way weather frightens people, and that this was a new and terrible power to have, and that he must learn to hold it quiet before it grew a mouth of its own. 900 years I've called that apple, Morwen said at last, quietly, and been proud of it. And you knelt down not knowing your own name a week ago, and you grew me a rowan out of the deep. She shook her head slow. I said you'd do it wrong, I take it back. You didn't do it wrong, child. You did it the way he'd have done it, the old way, the wanting with instead of the pushing against, and I never taught you that, I don't know that, I only ever pushed. That came up out of the blood, or up out of the staff, or up out of you, and I don't know which, and I'm not sure it matters." She got herself to her feet with the stick, refusing his hand, and stood over him, breathing hard. "It matters that others will want to know which, and they'll be coming. They felt the ninefold empty same as I did, only they've got sky and speed and 100 years of law between them and me, and they'll not stop at a cup of tea and a story. Come away from the water now, come away and let me think." They came up out of the alders into the high empty afternoon, and Morwen stopped at the top of the drove where the moor opened out flat and green to the foot of the tor, and she stood with her hand shading her eyes and looked up into the washed blue sky, and Harry looked where she looked, and at first there was nothing, only the height and the heat and one buzzard turning. Then he saw them, not birds. Higher than birds and stiller, 3 points of hard white light hung in the blue over the moor where no star had any business being in the afternoon, arranged in a line, not moving, not falling, watching the way the wand went cold for watching. And even as Harry found them, a fourth kindled beside the three, and then the whole line of them turned together, the way heads turn, and faced the black hollow of the ninefold in the alders below, and were still again. "There," said Morwen softly, and her old brown hand found Harry's shoulder again, not urgent now but heavy, the weight of a keeper who has kept a thing 900 years and feels the keeping slipping. "You wanted to know who'd come. That's the first of them up in the sky with their instruments, marking the spot on their maps. They'll not be the last nor the worst. Go home to your net curtains, child, and put the staff up your sleeve and your boring face on over it, and come to me at first light, and we'll see how long we've got before the world remembers the way to Avalon and comes walking down my drove." Her fingers tightened once on his shoulder and let go. "And Harry, whatever grows out of the water when you kneel by it, don't ever let them see it. Not the sky, not the drove, not a soul. A thing they can't see is a thing you still get to keep." Harry went home to his net curtains with the wand up his sleeve and his boring face on over the ringing name, and he did not look up at the 3 white lights again, because looking back was how you got seen, and being seen was the one luxury he could not yet afford. But he felt them on the back of his neck the whole way down the drove, cold as the mere, and he made himself a promise quietly so as not to be heard even by himself, that whoever they were up there with their maps and their instruments and their 100 years of law, they were going to find the moor a great deal harder to read than they expected, because the one at the middle of it had been unreadable his whole life and had got, in one hot week under a far green hill, very much more than a boy to hide. Chapter 2 and Chapter 3. The deep ledgers a mile beneath London, past the last vault that any living wizard had ever been shown, and down through 19 more that none of them knew existed. In a chamber the goblins did not name, because to name a thing is to admit it can be spoken of. The covenant of the ninefold had begun, for the first time in 900 years, to sing. It was not a pleasant sound. The goblins who cut that chamber had not built it for sound at all. They had built it for keeping, which is the oldest and the most serious of the goblin arts, older than smithing, older than gold, and the chamber kept the way a strongbox keeps, and the way a grave keeps, absolutely, without opinion, forever. Into its far wall, when the world was younger and the deep folk had cut their nation down into the roots of the island to be away from the quarrels of men, they had set a disc of black metal the height of a goblin and worked it edge to edge in a fineness no hand since had matched, and around its rim they had cut the covenant twice, once in their own hard-cornered law and once in the wet snaking letters of the owl folk who had come down to them, long ago, cap in hand, to ask a setting for stone. That disc had hung dark and cold and silent through the reigns of 40 high ledgers, and 40 high ledgers had walked past it on the day of their raising, and touched it once for form's sake and felt nothing, because there was nothing to feel, because the thing the covenant waited on had gone under the water and was not expected, by any sane accountant of the deep, to come up again. Now it sang. A single note low held, the note a struck bar of gold gives if the gold is pure enough and old enough and has been waiting long enough to be struck, and the note did not stop, and it filled the unnamed chamber and ran up the 19 vaults and set the coin humming in the lesser hoards above, so that in the counting halls where the day's dull business of dragons and drafts and the small dishonesties of wizards was done, every goblin in Gringotts stopped at the same instant and lifted his head and knew. Nagrok knew first, because Nagrok had been the one whose passing hand had woken it 2 days before, and Nagrok had not slept since. He was old for a goblin, which is very old indeed, and he was the loremaster of the deep account, keeper of the debts too ancient to be trusted to ink, and he had spent the whole of his long professional life in the honest belief that the covenant of the ninefold was a dead letter, a museum debt, a line in the oldest ledger that would never be called and could therefore be studied at leisure, the way a scholar studies a language no living mouth still speaks. He had been wrong. He was a goblin, and being wrong sat in him like a stone in the boot, and he did the only thing a goblin can do with a debt come suddenly, catastrophically live. He went to the high ledger, and he laid the account open, and he asked for judgment. The high ledger of the goblin nation was named Ragnok, and he received Nagrok in the low iron room where high ledgers received bad news, seated on nothing grander than a stool, because a goblin who needs a throne to feel like a king is a goblin who has already lost the thing that made him one. Listen to Nagrok read the covenant aloud, both rings of it, the goblin law and the owl folk's plea, and he listened to the notes singing up from the deep the whole while. And when Nagrok had finished, Ragnarok sat for a long moment with his chin on his fist and his black eyes half shut, doing sums. "Say it plainly, Loremaster," he said at last. "Strip the poetry off it. The owl folk owe us for the setting of the stone, and we owe them nothing, for the account was balanced when they paid. That is the ordinary reading. Give me the extraordinary one, the one that has you standing in my iron room with the dust of the deep vaults on your knees." "The account was not balanced," said Nagrok, "and there is the whole of it, high ledger. They paid for the setting in gold, and in gold we were paid, and that ledger is shut. But the covenant is a second instrument, cut into the same disk, and it is not a debt of gold, it is a debt of oath. Rise of the Isle came down to us in the last year before the water rose, and he did not come to buy. He came to swear. He swore that the deep folk should hold, against the day the staff woke, the right of first reckoning with the heir of his blood, that we and no other should be first to the return line, first to weigh it, first to offer it the deep law's protection or to refuse it, before ever a wizard's ministry or a wizard's schoolmaster laid a claim. And in return he swore that the heir, when he came, would honor the debt his blood owed to our craft, which is not gold, high ledger, for the setting was paid, but recognition, that the deep folk made the cradle that holds the light of Avalon, and that this making is remembered and named and never again called a wizard's marvel as though we had had no hand in it." Nagrok's voice, which had been dry and level as a good ledger should be, went drier still. "The staff has woken, the blood has come home. The right of first reckoning is live, and it has a clock on it, and the clock is the wizards, who felt the waking the same hour we did, and who do not honor covenants they were not party to, and who are at this moment already moving." Ragnarok opened his eyes fully then. "Then we move faster," he said. "Who is he?" "A child," said Nagrok. "The seeing stones show a child. On the old drowned levels under the Tor, where the deepest of the 9 meres lies, in the keeping of the last of the owl folk's wardens, an old woman with the knowing and no craft. The heir is 7 years old, high ledger, and he does not yet know what a ministry is, and he has already grown a rowan of living water out of the deep, which is a working 3 of our best water rights together could not manage, and which no wizard has done since rise, and which he did, the stones say, by asking." Nagrok let that sit. "I would go myself. The first reckoning should be read by the loremaster who woke it, and it should be read before the wizards reach him, because a covenant honored is worth 100 years of quarrel avoided, and a covenant lost is a wound that does not close in a goblin's lifetime, and I have watched in my life 3 such wounds open, and I would not open a 4th on my own carelessness." Ragnarok stood off his stool. He was not tall, no goblin is. But the iron room seemed to fit him more closely when he stood, and the singing note from the deep steadied, as though the covenant itself approved of being taken seriously at last. "Go," said the high ledger. "Take the reckoning tokens, and take the deep law, and take an escort of your choosing, and read the account to the child of Rise before the wizards spoil it. Offer him the protection of the nation on the terms of the covenant, no more and no less. Do not be generous, for generosity is an insult to a debtor and a trap for a creditor, and this is neither. Weigh him true. If he is false or grasping or a wizard's puppet already, close the account and come home, and we will let the wizards have their little apocalypse to themselves. But if he is what the water says he is—" Ragnarok stopped. Something crossed his hard face that was not quite hope, because goblins do not permit themselves hope, but was hope's dry cousin, the thing an accountant feels when a debt he had written off comes good. If he is what the water says, then the deep folk have been on the losing side of the wizarding age for 1,000 years, Loremaster, and the wheel may have just begun very slightly to turn. Go and see which. Far to the north, in a round office at the top of a tower, a man who had spent his whole long life turning wheels felt one turn that he had not set spinning, and did not like it. Albus Dumbledore had been awake since the note. He had many instruments in that office, silver and glass and spun brass, most of them his own devising, and they measured things that had no names in any language but the private one he kept for his own designs. The tension on certain old protections, the drift of certain bloodlines, the slow turning of the locks he had set, over the years, on doors he alone knew to be doors. One of these instruments, a slender thing of silver that had ticked out the safety of a house in Surrey for 6 years without once faltering, had faltered 2 nights ago. It had stopped, it had reversed, it had let out a curl of smoke the color of the light behind closed eyes, and then it had begun to tick again, but wrongly, unevenly, the way a heart ticks after a great fright, and Dumbledore had sat with it in his hands through the small hours and understood 2 things, and did not enjoy either. The first thing was that the protection he had bound about Harry at Privet Drive, the old deep magic of a mother's death that he had spent a night of his own blood and cunning anchoring into the mortar of his sister-in-law's house, was intact but had gone slack, the way a rope goes slack when the thing it was holding has walked to the end of its length and stopped pulling. The child was alive. The child was not in danger. He was simply somewhere the protection had never been meant to stretch, and had stretched to, and was now humming with the strain of it, far to the west, on ground that answered to an older magic than any Dumbledore had ever bound. The second thing was harder, and it had come with the Phoenix's note, and Fawkes had not sung that note before in all the years Dumbledore had known him, and would not sing it again, and would not, when asked, say what it meant, only turn one bright black eye on his old friend, and look at him with something that in a man Dumbledore would have called reproach. The second thing was that a door he had not known was a door older than the Ministry, older than Hogwarts, older than the wand and Latin trade itself, had come open on the drowned edge of the country, and that his boy, his carefully placed, carefully starved, carefully protected boy, the child he had put in a cupboard for love and for strategy in equal measure, and had never once let himself examine which measure was the larger, was standing in the doorway of it. He had not planned for this. That was what he sat with in the round office in the grey hour before his deputy would knock. Albus Dumbledore had planned for a great many things. He had planned for the return of the one who had marked the child, which he did not doubt was coming, slow and certain as rot. He had planned the long years of Harry's ordinary miserable childhood as one plans a firing, tempering a blade by keeping it cold and keeping it hungry and keeping it, above all, ignorant of its own edge until the hand that would wield it was ready. He had told himself and had almost entirely believed that this was mercy, that a child who knew his worth too soon would be a child destroyed by those who wanted it, and that the cupboard and the cast-offs and the loveless years were the lesser cruelty, the price of a weapon kept safe in its sheath against the day the country would need it drawn. He had not planned for the sheath to fall open by itself. He had not planned for the blade to be, not the thin bright thing he had forged his whole strategy around, but something vast and old and green that had been sleeping under the water since before there were wizards to forge anything, and that had chosen the child for reasons that had nothing to do with a scar or a prophecy or a dark lord, and that would not, he understood already, with the cold, clear part of himself that had never once in 100 and some years steered him wrong, be kept in any sheath he owned. Well, said Dumbledore softly to the phoenix, to the failing instrument, to the grey window and the mountains beyond it going pink with the dawn. Well, this changes the shape of everything, and I have perhaps a week before it changes it past mending, and I must go and look at him, and I must decide when I have looked whether the kindest thing and the wisest thing are for once in this wretched business the same thing. He set the instrument down. They so rarely are. He did not answer the question of what he would do if they were not. He had learned long ago that a man who asks himself that question too early ties his own hands, and Albus Dumbledore had spent his life keeping his hands free. At first light on the moor, Harry was already at Morwen's door. He had not slept much. He had lain in the box room with the wand along his arm and the 3 white lights burning on the back of his neck, and he had done sums until the sums ran out, and then he had watched the hymn book window go from black to grey to the pale gold that meant he could reasonably be up without waking the house, and he had gone out over the sagging gate and down the drove to the green mound of the keeper's cottage, and Morwen had opened the door before he knocked, dressed, awake, the fire already going. She too plainly had spent the night at Sums. They're closer, she said, by way of good morning. The sky watchers have gone, but something's come up the ground in the night, something old and iron-shod. I can feel it in the drove, same as I feel a change of weather in my knee. Come in, eat first. Whatever it is, you'll meet it better with bread in you. They did not get to the bread. They had barely got to the fire when the peat-colored cat came off its chair with all its fur standing and every claw out and went under the dresser and would not come out. And the drying green on the beams began to sway, though the door was shut and the window was shut and there was no wind in all the moor. And Morwen went still with the loaf in her 2 hands. And outside, coming down the drove in the new light, there was a sound Harry had never heard, a heavy jingling ringing tread, iron on stone. Many feet in step, and under it a deeper note, the same low-held note that had sung up the deep vaults a mile beneath London, the note of the Covenant come walking. Ah, said Morwen, and put the loaf down, and there was fear in her old face, plain and unhidden, and under the fear something almost like relief, because a known terror is easier than an unknown one. So it's them first. Well, better them than the other lot if we mind our manners, Harry. She turned to him and gripped his shoulders, both of them hard, and looked into his face from a hand's breadth off. Listen to me and listen close, for I'll not get to say it twice. These are goblins, the deep folk. What's coming down my drove is a reckoning 900 years old, and how you meet it is the whole of everything. Do not thank them, do not offer them anything, do not call them friend, and do not call them enemy. A goblin deals in debt and craft and covenant and nothing else, and he weighs you the whole time he's speaking. And if you lie, he'll know, and if you grovel, he'll despise you, and if you swagger, he'll break you. You stand up straight and you tell the exact truth, and you remember that you are the blood of the one they made the cradle for, and that the debt is theirs to you as much as yours to them, and you do not, whatever you do, let them see your 7. She let go. She stepped back. Can you do that? Harry looked at the door. The ringing tread had stopped outside it. The low note filled the cottage. I've been not letting people see things my whole life, he said. It's the only thing I'm really good at. The knock, when it came, was not made with a hand. It was made with the foot of a staff of black iron, 3 times, and each time the low note swelled. And Morwen crossed the room and opened her own door to the deep folk with the dignity of 900 years of keepers behind her. And there on the threshold in the gold morning light stood Nagrok, loremaster of the deep account, in mail that had never seen the sun, flanked by 6 goblins of the escort with the iron faces of creatures that had never once in their long lives been in a hurry. And Nagrok looked past the old woman, past the keeper, past everything in the low warm room, to the child standing very straight by the fire with a foot of pale wood held along his forearm, and the loremaster of the deep account, who had not bowed to a living thing above ground in 300 years, inclined his head the precise and measured half-inch that goblin law reserves for a creditor whose account is open and unpaid. "Eravim rise," said Nagrok, in a voice like a key turning in a lock that has not been oiled since the world was young. "The covenant of the ninefold is awake, and I am come to read it. Will you hear the account?" Harry did not thank him. He did not offer him anything. He did not call him friend. He looked at the goblin in the mail that had never seen the sun, and he thought, quickly, first fact first, the sums running clean and cold behind his steady face. This one has come a long way and come fast, and a person who comes fast wants something, and a person who wants something can be dealt with if I can only work out what it is before he works out what I am. "I'll hear it," Harry said. "But I don't know what an account is, or a covenant, or a reckoning, and I won't pretend I do, because you'd know I was pretending. So you'll have to read it slowly. And I'd rather you came in and sat down, because my keeper has made bread, and it's rude to do business in a doorway." He paused and added, because Morwen had told him not to call them friend or enemy, but had not told him he could not simply be honest, and honesty had a way of doing what cleverness could not. "And because I'm not tall enough to talk to you comfortably while you're standing up, and I'd rather you saw that and we both stopped pretending about it than have it be a thing you noticed later and used." There was a silence in the doorway. The 6 goblins of the escort did not move. And Nagrok, loremaster of the deep account, looked at the 7-year-old who had just declined to hide the one weakness he could not have hidden anyway, and had thereby taken it off the table as a weapon, and something happened in the loremaster's iron face that had not happened in a very long time, a slight, dry, upward movement at one corner of the wide mouth, the goblin equivalent, though Harry could not have known it, of a man sitting up in his chair. "The heir," said Nagrok to no one, to the covenant, to the deep record that he would carry home, invites the deep folk to sit and offers bread and names his own smallness before it can be named for him. He stepped over the threshold, and the escort came in behind him, iron and cold and jingling, and the low, warm room of the last keeper on the moor was suddenly very full of the oldest law in the island. "We do not eat the bread of a debtor, it confuses the account. But we will sit, Eravim rise, and we will read, and I will tell you now before we begin, that in 300 years above ground I have read many reckonings to many claimants, and not one of them has begun by telling me a true thing that cost him something to say. You have begun better than kings, do not spoil it." They sat. Nagrok took the one good chair from which the cat had fled, and the escort ranged themselves along the walls, and Morwen stood by her fire with her arms folded and her keeper's dignity about her, and Harry sat on the stool across the scrubbed table from the loremaster, with the wand laid where they both could see it, and the reading of the account began. It took the whole of the morning. Nagrok read the covenant twice, both rings, the goblin law and the owlfolk's plea, and he explained each clause in the flat, exact language of the deep, and Harry listened with the whole of himself and asked, when he did not understand, the smallest question first and did not once pretend, and the loremaster answered each question with a care that grew, clause by clause, into something the escort along the walls could feel and did not have a word for. Harry learned that the deep folk had made the cradle of the stone. He learned that the stone was not a jewel but a made thing, a vessel, and that inside it slept the greater part of the light of Avalon, and that the goblin's whole claim was not to the light, which was the Isle S, but to the naming, that the world should know and say that the deep folk's craft was half of what held the light in the world, and that this had been forgotten deliberately by the wizards who wrote the histories, and that the forgetting was the wound, the old unhealed goblin wound, older than any war. "That's not fair," Harry said at that, and Nagrok stopped and looked at him, and Harry went on because the unfairness of it had gone straight into the place where his own life lived, the place that knew exactly what it was to do a thing and have someone else be thanked for it, or have it not be thanked at all. "You made the cradle. Without the cradle the light would spill. You did half the work and the books say you did none of it. That's the meanest kind of stealing there is, because you can't even prove it was taken." He looked at the wand on the table, at the knot of grown wood and the dark stone in its cage of goblin craft. "If it's mine now, the staff, then the naming's mine to give, isn't it? I can say it. I can say the deep folk made the cradle wherever it matters to whoever's listening. I can put it back in the books." He frowned, working it. "That doesn't cost me anything. So either it's worth less than you're making it sound, or I'm missing something, because you've come a long way and gone to a lot of trouble for a thing I'd give you for free the minute you asked." Nagrok was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, the flatness had gone out of his voice, and under it was the thing that had been under Ragnar's voice in the Iron Room, the dry cousin of hope. "You are missing nothing, heir of Imrais," the loremaster said. "That is precisely the trouble. For 1,000 years we have offered that bargain to wizard after wizard, that they should simply say the true thing, name our craft, mend the wound with a word that costs them nothing. And for 1,000 years not one of them would pay it, because to a wizard a word is never nothing, a word given to a goblin is a step down. A debt owed to the deep folk is a shame to be buried, and they would sooner keep a lie in their books than admit they were ever helped from below. And here sits a child of 7 in a keeper's cottage who cannot see why it should cost him anything at all, and offers it for free in the first hour without being asked." He put his hard hand flat on the table near the wand, not touching it. "You do not understand yet what you have just done. You will. When you are older and have learned what wizards are, you will understand that you have offered the deep folk freely, the one thing we have wanted for 1,000 years and been refused, and that in offering it you have made the covenant good and more than good, and that the debt has shifted, this morning in this room, further onto our side of the ledger than it has ever stood. The nation will hear of this before nightfall. The high ledger will hear of it within the hour." Harry turned the wand a quarter turn on the table, thinking, and asked the question that had been sitting under all the others since the keeper's careful blank face the day before. "There's something else down there," he said. "Under the water. My keeper said some of what sunk was put down to sleep and some was put down to be kept, and she went funny in the face and wouldn't say the rest. You keep records of everything. Do you know what it is?" Nagrok was quiet for a moment, and the 6 goblins of the escort along the walls, who had not moved a muscle through the whole of the morning, moved now, a small settling of iron, the sound of creatures reminded of a thing they would rather not have been reminded of. "We know what it is," the loremaster said, "because we cut the vault that holds it, and a goblin remembers every vault he cuts, and every vault his fathers cut forever. That is the whole of what a goblin is. Yes, heir of Imrais." When Imrais folded the aisle shut and drew the water up over his sleep, he did not do it only to hide a treasure from the greedy age that was coming. He did it to keep a lid on something. There was a lord of the old British magic in his day who wanted what Imrais had, wanted the seam in the world and the folding of the hours and the light under the stone, wanted to own it and to sell it and to be a king forever on the back of it, and when he could not have it by asking, he tried to take it by drowning the one who held it, and Imrais, who was gentle by every account we keep, did the one hard thing of his life. He turned the water on the taker. He drowned the drowner. And because a thing of that much magic does not die when its body dies, only sinks, he did not kill him, he could not, he only bound him, laid him down under the deepest of the 9 with the whole weight of Avalon on top of him for a lid, and set the water and the staff and the isle and the sleeping self of Imrais all into one lock, so that nothing could come up without everything coming up. Nagrok looked at the black mirror that neither of them could see, a mile of morning away through the wall. "You have taken the staff off the top of that lock, child. The lid still holds, the isle still lies over him, but the water is loose now, and a bound thing that has felt the water go loose after 1,000 years does not go back to sleep politely. That is not the deep folks' affair. It is written in no covenant of ours. We will not lift a finger over it, for it is the isle's own quarrel and none of our making. But you ask me a true thing, and I will answer it true. Whatever comes to your more wearing a kind face, heir of Imrais, is not the worst thing your hand woke when it closed on that staff. The worst thing is patient and cold and directly beneath your keeper's feet, and it is learning, even now, how to stand." The fire ticked. Morwen had gone very still by the hearth. Harry looked at the wand, warm and pale and blameless, on the scrubbed table, and did not say anything for a moment, because there was nothing a person said to that, and pretending there was would have been the kind of lie the loremaster could smell. "Thank you for telling me the true one," he said at last, and then caught himself, and a flicker of something almost like humor went over his tired face. "I'm not allowed to thank you, am I?" My keeper said. "All right, I won't thank you. But I'll remember you didn't make it smaller to spare me, because grown-ups always make it smaller to spare me, and it only ever makes it worse, and you didn't, and I'll remember that when I'm working out who to trust." "Remember it," said Nagrok. "It is a better ledger to keep than most." He drew from his mail a token, a coin of the same black metal as the great disc, worked on one face with the staff and on the other with the angular goblin law, and he set it on the scrubbed table and slid it across to Harry with one finger, the goblin gesture of a bargain sealed. "The protection of the nation," Nagrok said. "On the terms of the covenant, no more and no less. Do not thank me for it, it is owed. Carry this. It will pass you through any door of Gringotts unquestioned, at any hour, and it will tell any goblin who sees it that you are under the deep law, and that a hand raised against you is a hand raised against the account, and the account, heir of Imrais, is a thing the deep folk have gone to war over more than once and won. You are 7 years old, and you have no allies in the wide world above, and a great many people are, at this moment, deciding what to do about you. As of this morning you have one ally who does not love you, does not pity you, and will not fail you, because a goblin does not fail a covenant, not for gold, not for fear, not for 1,000 years. That is worth more than love. Learn to know that it is worth more than love, and you will do well in the world you have woken. Harry took the coin. It was cold, and then it was not cold, the way the wand had been cold and then warm, learning his hand. He did not thank the lore master. He looked at him instead straight and said, I'll put your craft back in the books, every book I can reach. And when I'm bigger and I understand better what it cost you to be left out of them, I'll understand better what I'm promising, and I'll promise it again then, properly, knowing. That's the best I can do at 7. Will it hold? It will hold, said Nagrok and rose, and the escort came off the walls in their iron and their cold. For a goblin knows the difference between a promise made in ignorance and a promise made in knowledge, and honors the first as a seed and the second as a harvest. And you have given me both in the space of a morning, which is more than the last king of wizards gave me in a life. At the door he stopped and turned, and for the length of one held note the lore master of the deep account looked at the child and the old woman and the low fire and the foot of pale wood on the table, and something crossed the iron of his face that was almost gentle, and was gone. Guard the water, keeper, he said to Morwen. The wizards come today or tomorrow, and they do not honor covenants they were not party to, and one of them wears a kind face, and it is the kind face you must fear, for it will offer the child everything and mean to keep the one thing that matters. The deep folk cannot walk in the sunlit world to stand between you and him. That is not in the covenant, and we do not do what is not in the covenant. But send to us by the coin if the water is threatened, and we will come as far as the law allows, and the law allows further than the wizards think. The low note faded. The account is open. The reckoning is good. We are content. Then the deep folk went back up the drove the way they had come, iron on stone ringing, and the low note went with them and sank into the ground, and the peat-colored cat came out from under the dresser and pretended it had never left. And Morwen sat down in the chair the lore master had vacated like someone whose legs had quit under her, and looked at Harry across the room with the black coin in his hand and the wand on the table, and did not say anything for a while. Harry turned the coin over. Staff on one side, hard-cornered law on the other. Under the deep law, one ally who would not fail him. He was 7, and he had just done business with the oldest thing in the island and come out of it. He was fairly sure ahead, and the largeness of that was sitting on him now that the goblin's black eyes were no longer holding him up, and his hands had begun very slightly to shake, the loose, distant shaking of a body that has been braver than it had any right to be. You said don't let them see I'm 7, he said, to steady himself with the sound of working it out, but I did the opposite. I told him first thing, and it worked better. It worked, Morwen agreed from the chair, and there was wonder in her voice and something under the wonder that was closer to grief, the particular grief of watching a child be forced to be wise before his time and be terribly good at it. It worked because you didn't do it to work. You did it because it was true, and a goblin can smell the difference between a true thing said for its own sake and a true thing said to win, and you've no idea yet how rare the first one is, above ground or below. That's the whole of your danger and the whole of your hope, child, both at once. You're honest in a world that's forgotten how, and it will save your life, and it will nearly get you killed, sometimes in the same afternoon. She got up slow and put the loaf back over the fire to warm, because a keeper feeds people. It is what a keeper does. Eat now. You've earned it, and you'll need it, for the lore master was right about the wizards, and he was right about the kind face, and the kind face, unless my knee lies, and it never lies, is already on the road. Harry ate the warm bread, and the shaking went out of his hands, and for a while neither of them said anything, and the peat-colored cat came and put itself against his ankle and permitted itself to be scratched, which Morwen said afterward it had not done for any living soul in 11 years, and Harry, who had never in his life been permitted to be a comfort to anything, sat very still so as not to spoil it and scratched the cat behind its ragged ear and felt something in his chest ease that he did not have a name for and did not try to find one. Can I ask you a not important question, he said when the loaf was gone, in the middle of all the important ones, because I've been saving it and it won't keep. Ask, why does it work when I don't push the water? He turned the wand over. Every other magic I ever heard of in stories, you say the word and you wave the stick and you make the thing happen, you push it into being. But the lore master said I grew the rowan by asking, and you said Rise did it that way, the wanting with, and I did do it that way, I felt it, there wasn't any pushing. There was just me and the water wanting the same thing so hard there wasn't a gap between us for the doing to happen in, and it was easier than anything. It was easier than lying to Aunt Petunia. So why doesn't everyone do it the easy way? Morwen looked at him for a while over her folded arms, and the fire ticked, and out on the moor the curlew went over crying. Because the easy way costs the one thing most folk won't pay, she said. You have to want with the thing instead of wanting at it, and to do that you have to stop for that one moment being separate from it. You have to let there be no gap. And most folk, child, most wizards and most men, and near enough every soul I ever met, spend their whole lives making the gap wider, not narrower, walling themselves off. I hear in the world there, me and mine and the rest of you can drown. They couldn't ask the water to rise if their lives hung on it because they forgot how to stop being separate from a thing long enough to agree with it. You haven't forgotten. you never learned is nearer the truth of it. Nobody ever gave you enough of a self to wall off, God forgive them, and so the wall never got built, and where the wall should be there's just you, open on all sides, and the water walks straight in. She said it gently, but she did not soften the sorrow in it, and Harry heard the sorrow and understood dimly that she had just told him that the thing which made him strong and the thing which had been done to him were the same thing, and he turned that over and did not know yet where to put it and put it away to look at later. So I have to stay like this, he said. Open, even when it's dangerous, even when there's a cold thing learning to stand and a kind face on the road. That's the trap of it, Morwen agreed. The staying open is what makes you able, and the staying open is what makes you hurtable, and there's no keeping the one without the other, and anyone who tells you different wants to close you up and put a leash where the wall is. That'll be the kind face's whole song, mark me. Safety. Let me keep you safe, child, let me keep the great dangerous thing safe. Give it here, close yourself up small where I can guard you. And every word of it will be true, and every word of it will be a cage. She unfolded her arms and reached across, and for the first time laid her old brown hand flat on the crown of his head, the way you bless a thing or claim it, and Harry, who flinched from raised hands out of long habit, did not flinch from this one. You keep yourself open, Harry Potter, blood of him rise, and you keep the staff, and you let a foolish old woman and an iron goblin and a woman made of water stand as much between you and the closing as we're able, which is not as much as I'd like. And when the kind face sings you the safety song, you remember it was a keeper who couldn't spell her own name past the third letter that told you first. The cage is always offered for your own good. Always. That's how you know it's a cage. She took her hand off his head, the moment folded shut. She became brisk, because a keeper who lingers in the soft places frightens the young, and she began gathering the crocks off the table. Now go home, she said, before your net curtain people miss you and make a fuss on the very morning you can least afford a fuss. Put the coin somewhere they'll never think to look, which is anywhere clean, for they've no more notion of looking in a clean place than a fox has of looking up. Come tomorrow if the road's still empty, and Harry, she stopped with the crocks in her hands. You did a great and dangerous and lonely thing this morning, and you did it better than grown men, and there's no one in your life will ever know to be proud of you for it but me. So I'll do it for the both of them, the mother you can't remember and the father you never had, and for the whole thin line of the blood that's been waiting 1,000 years for a hand warm enough. I'm proud of you. Now get, before I say something else soft, and we're both embarrassed. Harry got. But he went down the drove lighter than he had come up it, for all the cold thing under the moor and the kind face on the road, because a person can carry a great deal of dark if someone has just told them, and meant it, that they are worth being proud of, and no one in his rememberable life had ever once done so before, and he held it against the inside of his chest the whole way home, next to the ringing name, where nobody could see it and nobody could take it. Out beyond the moor, on the ordinary sunlit roads of a July morning, a great many miles of them still to go but fewer with every hour, a man with half-moon spectacles and a kind face and a heart that had learned, long ago and for the best of reasons, to grieve for the very people it had decided to use, was coming west to look at a boy, and to decide, when he had looked, whether the kindest thing and the wisest thing were for once the same. And Harry, eating warm bread in a keeper's cottage, with a goblin's coin cooling in his pocket and Merlin's staff on the table, and the whole drowned country greening quietly around him, did not yet know his face, but had already, without knowing it, been warned twice, by a woman of water and a goblin of iron, to fear it. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4. Those who watched the kind face came to Withy End on the third evening, wearing a suit of plum-colored wool that no one in the whole flat county owned the imagination to have made, and knocked on the front door like an ordinary caller, and Harry, who was setting the table because Petunia had discovered that a boy who set tables could be blamed if the forks were wrong, knew before the second knock landed exactly who it was. He knew because the wand went cold. Not the cold it kept for Dudley, which was a warning the size of a fist. This was the cold of the mirror itself, the deep patient cold of the black water running the length of his forearm under his sleeve, and it did not spike and fade as it did for ordinary danger. It settled and stayed, and Harry understood, laying it out fact first with a fork in his hand, that the wand had met this particular caller before, somewhere back of the 1,000 years, and had not liked what it met. He set the last fork down straight. He made his face into the boring face. And he was standing very still by the good table when Uncle Vernon, purpling with the effort of being polite to a stranger dressed like a conjurer, showed the visitor into the front room, and the visitor's eyes went over the whole of it, the net curtains and the flying ducks and the swollen furniture, and came to rest, mild and blue and terrible behind their half-moon spectacles, on Harry. "Good evening," said Albus Dumbledore. "You must be Harry. I am so very sorry to intrude on your holiday. My name is Professor Dumbledore, and I am, in a manner of speaking, an old friend of your family, and I have come rather a long way to talk to you, if your aunt and uncle can spare you for half an hour." Petunia had gone the color of old candle wax. She knew the name. Harry watched her know it, watched the knowing go through her like a draught through a house, and understood that whatever Dumbledore was, he was a thing that could make Aunt Petunia afraid, and Harry had lived his whole life in the science of Aunt Petunia's fears and had never once seen this one before. Vernon was already halfway into a bluster about not wanting any funny business under his roof, and Dumbledore turned the mild blue eyes on him and said nothing at all, only looked pleasantly, and the bluster died in Vernon's throat the way the machine on the levels had died under the alders, cut off clean, a door shut on it. In the silence after it, Dumbledore's voice was gentle as ever. "Half an hour," he said, "in the garden, perhaps, where the evening is fine. I shall not keep him from his supper." They went into the garden. Harry went because the wand was cold and staying cold, and because a thing you have been warned about twice is a thing you had better look at with your own eyes while other people are near, and because he had already worked out that saying no to this visitor in front of Aunt Petunia would teach him more about Harry than half an hour of talking would. So he walked out onto the scrubby lawn of Withy End in the long amber light with the most dangerous person he had ever stood beside, and the far hill stood up green and secret over the flat country, and Dumbledore looked at it for a while before he looked at Harry. "A remarkable part of the world this," the old man said, "older than it looks. There are places in these levels where the ground remembers being water, and the water remembers being something else again, and a person who knows how to listen can hear it on a still evening remembering." He turned, the spectacles caught the light. "You have been listening, I think, haven't you, Harry? You have heard something out here that has been asleep a very long time, and it has heard you, and that is why I have come. Not to frighten you, please believe that above all things. I have come because a very great and very old power has woken on these moors, and it has attached itself to a child, and children who carry great powers are in great danger always from everyone, and I should like, if you will let me, to help keep you safe." It was, Harry thought, standing in the amber light with his boring face on and the cold wand along his arm, a very good speech. It was warm and it was true, and every word of it fitted, and that was exactly the trouble, because Morwen had told him, and the goblin had told him, and the woman of water had told him, each in their own words, that the kind face would offer him everything and mean to keep the one thing that mattered, and that its harm would wear the face of his good. So Harry did not answer the speech. He answered the thing under the speech, because he had spent 7 years learning to hear the thing under the speech. It was how you survived a house that smiled while it starved you. "How did you know where I was?" he asked. Dumbledore's expression did not change, but something behind it recalibrated, the way a chess player's does when the child across the board makes a move out of a book the child cannot possibly have read. "I have watched over you your whole life," he said, "and that too was true, and that too was the trouble. From a distance, for your protection. There's a woman near your aunt's house in Surrey, a Mrs. Figg, who has kept a kindly eye on you these 6 years and told me you were well. When you came west, she could no longer see you, and my other instruments told me that you had come somewhere that mattered, and I was afraid for you, and I came." He spread his long hands. "I know how that must sound, watched. It is an ugly word for a loving thing, but you have enemies you have never met, Harry, older than you and more patient, and one day, not soon, but one day, one of them will come for you, and everything I have done, the watching, the keeping you with your aunt, all of it that must look to you like coldness, has been to see that you are alive and whole on the day you must face him. I am not your jailer. I am the one who has been standing between you and the dark since before you can remember." And there it was. Harry heard it land. Mrs. Figg, who had left him alone in her cabbage-smelling front room 100 afternoons, and who he had thought was only a lonely old woman with too many cats, had been telling this man about him for 6 years. The watching had been going the whole time. The cupboard, the cast-offs, the loveless years, all of it known, all of it permitted, by the kind face standing in front of him now saying it had done it for love. Harry turned it over quickly, coldly, first fact first, and the first fact was the largest, and he made himself hold it. This man had known where Harry lived and how Harry lived, had had a woman watching, and had left him in the cupboard anyway, not from ignorance, on purpose, for a reason. And a person who leaves a child in a cupboard on purpose and for a reason is a person who has decided the child is for something, and Harry knew, better than he knew anything, exactly how it felt to be a thing that was for something rather than a person who was someone, because that was the whole of what the Dursleys had made him. And here was a kinder, cleverer, infinitely more dangerous version of the very same arithmetic, dressed in plum-colored wool and calling itself his protector. "You knew," Harry said, not angry. He had learned long ago that anger was a luxury that got you hit. He said it flat, the way you read out a sum you have checked twice. "About the cupboard where I sleep. You knew the whole time, and you had a lady watching to make sure I was, what did you say, alive and whole, not happy, alive and whole. Those are different, and you picked the two that mattered to you and not the one that mattered to me, and you picked them on purpose because I'm for something. That's what all this is. I'm a thing you're keeping in good enough condition to use later." He looked up at the old man with the mild blue eyes, and he was 7, and his voice did not shake, and that was the most frightening thing about the whole conversation to the one person present old enough to understand it. "My keeper told me you'd offer me safety. She said every word of it would be true, and every word of it would be a cage. She was right, wasn't she? You're not lying to me. That's what makes you worse than my uncle. My uncle lies, you just leave things out. For a long moment Albus Dumbledore said nothing at all, and the amber light went redder over the tor, and somewhere out on the moor the curlew cried its lonely bubbling cry, and the old man's face did a thing that Harry had not expected and did not know what to do with. It grieved. Not performed grief, the real thing, quick and involuntary and instantly mastered, the grief of a man who has just been shown, by a child, the exact shape of a wound he has spent 40 years not looking at directly. When Dumbledore spoke again, the twinkle had gone out of him, and what was left was older and plainer and in its way more honest. "You are quite right," he said quietly. "I did know, I do leave things out. It is the great vice of men who believe themselves wise, that they decide what others may be trusted to bear, and portion out the truth like medicine and call it kindness. I have done it your whole life. I told myself that a boy who did not know his own importance would grow up safer than one who did, and there was truth in that. There is always truth in it. That is what makes it so difficult to stop. But you have named the thing I did not let myself name, that alive and whole is not the same as happy, and that I chose the first two and spent the third, yours, without asking you. That was wrong. I will not insult you by pretending it was not." He inclined his head the smallest fraction, and it was not the goblin's half-inch of a creditor. It was something more like the bow of one player to another across a board. "But I must tell you the rest of the true thing, Harry, even knowing you will hear the cage in it, because it is still true. The power you have woken is not safe, not for you and not for anyone. It is older than any law we have to hold it, and there are people already turning toward this moor who will burn the whole of the West Country to have it, and you are 7 years old, and wanting to keep yourself is not the same as being able to. I would rather you hated me and lived than trusted me and died. If that is a cage, then I have spent my life building cages, and burying the children who were left outside them, and I have learned which I can bear." Harry looked at him for a while. The cold wand lay along his arm, and it had not warmed 1 degree the whole time, not even when Dumbledore grieved, and Harry had already learned to trust the wand's cold over his own pity, because the wand had drowned worse things than sad old men, and knew more than he did about what wore a kind face. "I believe you think that," Harry said at last. "I don't think you're lying, but I've worked something out standing here, and I'll tell it to you because my keeper says a true thing said for its own sake is worth more than a clever thing said to win, and I want to find out if that's true for you like it was for the goblin." He drew a breath. "The dangerous thing isn't the power. The dangerous thing is people who have already decided what to do with it. You, the ones coming to burn the West Country. Everybody wants to take it somewhere and lock it up for me or against me or away from the others, and every single one of you thinks you're the safe pair of hands. And I don't know very much. I'm 7. I say sorry to gateposts. But I know that when everyone's fighting over a thing, the thing is safest with the one person who doesn't want to take it anywhere. And that's me. I don't want to take it anywhere. I just want it not to be taken. So the safest hands in the whole business are the ones that already have it. Mine. And you can't hear that because you've spent 40 years being the safe pair of hands, and it's never once occurred to you that the job might not be yours." Dumbledore was silent again. Then slowly he did something that surprised the 6-year surveilled boy in front of him and would have astonished the entire Wisengamot. He sat down on the low garden wall of a rented cottage, so that his eyes were nearly level with Harry's, an old man in plum wool folding himself down onto damp Somerset stone, and he looked at Harry with the twinkle gone and the grief mastered, and something underneath both that Harry would only much later have a word for, which was respect. "May I see it?" Dumbledore asked, "Not take it, see it. I give you my word, which I have broken in my life exactly as often as I have decided the breaking served a greater good, so weigh it as you like, that I will not lay a finger on it. But I have read every account of the staff of Emrys that survives in the wide world, which is 4, and 3 of them contradict the others, and I have wanted, for a great many years, only to know whether the thing was real. Will you show an old man the real thing before we quarrel about who is to keep it?" And Harry, watching the wand's cold along his arm, made a decision that was either the cleverest or the most reckless of his short life, and could not himself have said which. He drew the wand out of his sleeve and held it up, small and pale in the red evening light, and he did not hand it over, and he watched the old man's face while he did it. He would remember that face. Dumbledore looked at the foot of worn wood with the knot of grown wood at its head and the dark stone in its cradle of goblin craft, and the mastered calm came off him like a dropped cloak, and what was under it was hunger. Not greed, not the burning greed Harry would later see on other faces. Something worse, because it was refined, a scholar's hunger, a hunger 100 years deep, the longing of a man who has spent his whole vast life reaching for the oldest and highest magic and has just been shown in the hand of a child he cannot command, the thing itself, the real thing, the source, and knows in the same instant that it will never, ever be his. It lasted a moment. He mastered it as he mastered everything. But Harry had seen it, and the wand had felt it, and the wand, in Harry's raised hand, in the presence of Albus Dumbledore, did the thing it had done for no one else in 1,000 years. It flinched. The stone in its cradle dimmed, the pale light in the wood drawing inward and down, the whole of it going cold and shut and small in Harry's fingers, a creature making itself less to escape notice, and Harry felt the flinch run up his own arm and into his own chest, and knew it for what it was, because he had made himself less to escape notice 10,000 times, and no one had ever once seen him do it. And now he had watched the oldest magic in Britain do it in front of a man in a nice suit. "Put it away," Harry said, and his voice had changed, and Dumbledore heard it change. "It doesn't want you to see it. It knows you, from before. I don't know what you were to each other 1,000 years ago, and I don't think you do either, but it knows you, and it's frightened of you, and it's never been frightened of anything since I pulled it out of the water, not the goblins, not the cold thing underneath, nothing. Only you." He slid the wand back up his sleeve, and its cold began slowly to ebb now that it was hidden. "So we're finished. You came to see if it was real. It's real. And now you know, and I know something too, which is that a thing that drowned a king to keep itself safe took one look at you and hid. That's all I need to know about whether you're a safe pair of hands. Thank you for coming a long way. I'll tell Aunt Petunia you were very kind." Albus Dumbledore rose from the garden wall. He looked down at the child in the amber light for a long moment, and there was no anger in him and no threat, and that was the most dangerous thing of all, because a man who is neither angry nor threatening after being refused is a man who has already stopped asking and started planning. "You are extraordinary," he said, and meant it, and it was not a compliment, it was a diagnosis. "You are 7 years old, and you have read me more truly in half an hour than colleagues of 40 years. Your mother could do that, it is why she is dead, and I with a share of the blame for it, which is one of the true things I leave out. I will go now, Harry, because you have asked me to, and because forcing a child is the surest way to teach him that force is the only language, and I have taught too many children that already." He walked a few steps toward the house and stopped and did not turn round. "But hear one last true thing, and hold it against the days coming, for they will be worse than you can imagine and sooner than you are ready. I am not the worst of what is turning toward this more. I am merely the first and the gentlest and the only one who will ask before he takes. When the others come, and they will come, you will wish the safe pair of hands had been mine. Send for me then. I will come. I will always come. That is the one promise I have never in my life broken, and it is the only one that has ever mattered." Then he walked into the house, and Harry heard him being courteous to Aunt Petunia, and heard the front door close, and stood alone in the red garden with the wand warming slowly against his arm, and did not go into his supper for a long while, because there are conversations after which a person needs to stand in a garden and be 7 for a bit, and this had been one of them. He went to Morwen at first light, over the sagging gate and down the drove through the dew, and she took one look at his face in the doorway and put the kettle on without a word, and did not ask him anything until he had a mug in his 2 hands and the fire had warmed the night out of him. Then she sat down across the scrubbed table and folded her old arms and said, "Tell me, all of it, and don't leave out the parts you're ashamed of, for those are the parts that matter." So Harry told her in order, first fact first, the plum wool and the knowing about the cupboard and the 6 years of Mrs. Figg, and Morwen's face went hard at the watching and harder at the cupboard, and when he came to the part where he had held the staff up and the old man's calm had come off like a dropped cloak and the hunger underneath had been 100 years deep, she went very still, and when he came to the part where the staff had flinched, had drawn itself small and cold to escape a man's notice, she put down her mug and reached across and took Harry's hand and held it hard and did not say anything for a while. "So it knows him," she said at last. "After 1,000 years, it drew the water on a king and it never once ducked its head, and it looked at your kind-faced professor and hid. That's told me more about him than 40 years of the prophet ever did." She let go of his hand and sat back. "Listen to me, child, for this is the whole of it, and I want you to carry it clean. There's 2 kinds of danger walking toward this water. There's the kind that wants to eat you, and you can see that kind coming. It's got teeth, and it doesn't pretend. And there's the kind that wants to keep you, and that kind is worse, because it comes with a warm coat and a true story, and it will sit on your garden wall and grieve real tears, and every word out of its mouth will be a fact. And at the bottom of all the facts is a cage with your name on it, and it built the cage because it loves you, which is the only thing in this world that can make a cage you'll walk into on your own 2 feet. The teeth you run from. The warm coat you have to think your way out of every single time forever, because it never stops offering and it never stops being partly right." She tapped the table. "You thought your way out of it last night, at 7. I've known grown wizards go into that man's study strong and come out leashed and grateful for the collar. You went into a garden and came out still your own. I'd be prouder if I weren't so frightened." "He said he's the gentlest of them," Harry said. "He said when the others come I'll wish the safe hands had been his. Was he lying?" "No," said Morwen, and there was no comfort in it, because she did not deal in comforts that weren't true. "That's the worst of it. He wasn't lying. The others coming are worse, but worse isn't the only question, child. A gentle keeper's still a keeper, and a soft cage is still a cage, and being grateful your jailer's kind is how a body forgets it's in a cell. You keep both true at once, that he's the gentlest and that he still means to have you, and you don't let the first one talk you out of the second, and you'll be all right. That's a hard thing to hold, 2 true things that don't like each other. Most grown folk can't. You'll have to." She got up and cut bread, because the sun was up and the child was thin and a keeper feeds people, and we've less time than I hoped. If the kind face has been and gone, the teeth aren't far behind, and you're not ready, and there's no making you ready, so we'll do the next best thing, which is make you readier faster than's wise. You'll come to the water every day now. Every day the net curtain people will spare you and some they won't, and on the days they won't you'll practice at home where they can't see. The calling and the naming and the holding quiet, and I'll teach you everything I've got left, which isn't much, and the staff will teach you the rest, which is everything. Eat your bread, school's begun. Far to the north, in the round office at the top of the tower, Albus Dumbledore did not sleep either. He sat with the failing silver instrument in his hands and turned the evening over, the child on the garden wall, the flinch of the staff, the terrible clear sentence, the safest hands in the whole business are the ones that already have it. He was old enough and honest enough, in the small hours, with no audience but a phoenix, to admit that the child had beaten him. Not defeated, not yet, but beaten, in the particular way that a truth beats a strategy cleanly, without malice, leaving the strategist standing in the wreckage of his own cleverness with nowhere to put his hands. Harry had seen the cage. Worse, he had seen that the cage was built of love, which was the one material Dumbledore had always trusted to hold, because it had never before been recognized for what it was by the thing inside it. He did not change his aim. That was the part he examined most carefully, turning it in the instrument's failing light, because a wiser man might have changed it, and Dumbledore had never been quite as wise as he was clever, and knew it, and the knowing had never yet been enough to stop him. He still intended to have the staff kept safe, which meant kept where he could reach it, which meant, in the end, kept from the child until the child could be trusted to want what Dumbledore wanted, and he still intended to have Harry alive on the day the dark returned, which meant Harry under his hand in his school, inside his protections. The aim did not change, only the method. He could not take, the child had shown him that, taking would teach the child that force was the only tongue, and would drive him into the arms of the goblins or the moor or whatever worse thing came next. So he would not take, he would do the patient thing, the legitimate thing, the thing that wore no visible chain at all. He would go to the ministry quietly, and establish himself in law as Harry's magical guardian, which he could do, which he had grounds to do, the last living friend of the murdered parents, the natural protector of an orphan of the war. And he would let the danger come, the teeth the child did not yet fear, and he would be careful, so careful, to arrive a half-step late, so that the child, terrified, cornered, out of allies, would send for him, would choose him, would walk into the cage on his own 2 feet and pull the door shut and be grateful. Because a cage chosen is a cage that holds, and Albus Dumbledore had learned in 100 and some years of building them, that the only lock that never fails is the one the prisoner turns himself. "I am going to save that child's life," he said to the Phoenix quietly in the gray hour, "and I am going to do it by making certain he has no one else to turn to, and I have told myself for 40 years that the two are the same act, and tonight, for the first time, I am not entirely sure, and I am going to do it anyway, because the alternative is a world with the child dead in it, and I have buried enough of them." Fawkes turned one bright black eye on him and did not sing, and the not singing was the loudest thing in the round office, and Albus Dumbledore set down the failing instrument and rose to begin the patient, legitimate work of becoming, in law and in love and in the slow closing of every other door, the only hands the child would have left to run to. 60 miles to the east, in a narrow house in a narrow street in a part of London the maps preferred not to dwell on, a man who had been waiting 40 years for this exact week was oiling the hinges of a very old box. Mordaunt Rook did not look dangerous, which was the first and least of his advantages. He looked like a retired schoolmaster of the drier sort, gray and spare and precise, with ink on his fingers and a way of holding his head slightly tilted, listening. He had held minor posts in his time and lost them, and held lesser ones and lost those, and had at last been left alone by a wizarding world that found him tedious and faintly unwholesome, and could not think of an actual law he had broken, and being left alone was the only thing Mordaunt Rook had ever truly wanted, because it let him work. He had spent his life on a single subject. Not the wand and Latin magic of the schools, which he despised as a child despises a toy it has outgrown, but the old magic, the wet green pre-Roman magic of the Isle before the Isle had wizards, the magic of Emrys and the Meres and the drowned country, and he had gathered every scrap of it that survived, bought and stolen and blackmailed out of 100 private hands, and pieced it together in the narrow house over 40 patient years. And he knew more about Avalon than any living soul except possibly the last mad keeper on the moor, and he knew one thing that the keeper in her kindness had never let herself fully believe. He knew what was under the water, not the light. Rook cared nothing for the light. The Isle and its orchards and its foolish folded hours were a fairy story for children, a thing to feel awe at, and Mordaunt Rook had burned the awe out of himself decades ago as a surgeon burns a wound clean. He cared for the cold. He had read in a book that had cost him a man's life, of the thing Emrys had drowned and bound under the deepest of the Nine, the lord who had wanted to own the seam in the world, and Rook had understood at once, with the clean cold understanding that was the whole of his genius, that a bound thing is a leashed thing, and a leashed thing is a weapon, and that the greatest power in the island was not the light everyone feared to touch, but the drowned king everyone had agreed to forget. Waiting under the lid for a hand cold enough to take up the lace the gentle old wizard had refused, in his softness, to hold. The book that had told him so had cost a man his life, and Rook thought of that transaction, when he thought of it at all, the way an accountant thinks of a rounding error, a small necessary imprecision on the way to a correct total. The seller had been a collector too, a soft, romantic collector of the sort Rook despised, who had bought the drowned book for its binding and never troubled to read the drowned language it was written in, and who had refused when Rook came to him with an honest offer to sell the one thing in his cluttered, foolish house that mattered. Rook had not shouted. Rook never shouted. He had simply explained, in his dry, precise way, over the course of a single quiet evening, the several things that would happen to the collector and the collector's family if the book were not sold, and then he had waited patiently, while the collector understood that the gray, listening person in his study was not making a threat but reading out a schedule, and the collector had sold the book at Rook's price, and had gone very white and very quiet, and had died within the year of nothing the healers could name. Which Rook considered none of his affair. He had the book, that was the total. The seller was the rounding error. This was the whole of Mordaunt Rook's morality, that there was a correct total in every ledger, and that reaching it was the only virtue, and it made him more dangerous than 100 cruel men, because cruelty tires and appetite sates and hatred burns itself out, and Rook was none of those things. Rook was only correct, tirelessly, patiently, without heat and without limit, a sum that would not stop adding until it reached its answer. And the answer for 40 years had been a single word, and the word was the drowned king. He had studied the binding of such a thing the way a locksmith studies a lock, from the outside, patiently, for decades, because he could not reach the mechanism. He knew the shape of Emrise's working. He knew the water was the seal, and the staff was the pin, and the isle was the weight. He knew that a leash laid on a bound god must be laid in the moment the seal first slipped, before the thing was strong enough to refuse it, and after it was awake enough to be bargained with, a window measured not in years but in days, perhaps in hours, and he had built his 3 cold tools against that window, the iron knife and the knot rope and the whole gray stone, and he had rehearsed the working 10,000 times in the narrow house until it was as smooth in him as breathing. He did not want the light. Let the gentle old man and the gray ministry and the whole soft, frightened world clutch and squabble over the light. Rook would let them. Rook had built his entire 40-year patience on the certainty that the world, faced with a sunrise and a sewer, would post all its guards at the sunrise, and he intended, while they gaped at the golden thing coming up out of the water, to go quietly down the drain and take the cold. For 40 years the water had lain over it, and Rook had waited because he could do nothing else. The lock was sealed, the staff was sunk, the blood was scattered. And then 3 nights ago every instrument in the narrow house had woken at once, the pendulum swinging, the black water in the scrying bowl clearing, the old maps warming under his ink-stained fingers, and Mordaunt Rook had sat very still in his narrow house, exactly as a goblin had sat still in the deep and an old woman had sat still on the moor, and had understood that the water was loose, and that somewhere on the drowned levels a hand had closed on the staff of Emrise and turned the lock at last. And that everything he had waited 40 years for was, this week, for the taking. He did not hurry. Hurry was for men who were not certain, and Mordaunt Rook had never in his life been more certain of anything. He finished oiling the hinges of the box, and he opened it, and from its felt bed he lifted the 3 things he had assembled over 40 years for exactly this errand. A knife of cold iron with a hilt of drowned bog oak, a coil of what looked like ordinary rope and was not, and a flat gray stone the size of a hand with a single hole worn through the middle of it, the kind of stone the old folk had called a hagstone and hung over their doors to keep the drowned dead out, and which Rook intended to use with the exact and joyless precision that was the whole of him, for the opposite purpose entirely. Soon, he said to the box, to the knife, to the drowned king 60 miles away learning to stand. His voice was dry and quiet and entirely without appetite, which was the most frightening thing about it, because appetite can be reasoned with, and Mordaunt Rook had no appetite, only purpose. Very soon now, they will all be tripping over one another to guard the light. And while they guard the light, I shall walk in the back way and take the cold and put a leash on the oldest king in England, and then I think we shall see how the wizarding world enjoys being asked for once to kneel. He closed the box. He took his coat from its peg, and Mordaunt Rook went out into the London evening and turned his precise grey face toward the west and began, without hurry and without doubt, to walk toward the moor. Deeper still under London, though not so deep as the goblins, in the windowless heart of the Ministry of Magic, where the Department of Mysteries kept the questions no one was permitted to ask aloud, an instrument that had no name and measured a thing that had no name had been screaming, silently, for 3 days. Saul Croker had worked in the department for 30 years, and in that time he had learned to read the unnamed instruments the way a farmer reads the sky. And this one had never in 3 decades moved past the second mark, and it was now hard against the ninth and straining, and Croker stood before it in his gray unspeakable's robes with his hands folded into his sleeves, and did the calm arithmetic of a man whose whole profession is the containment of the incalculable. Something ancient had woken in the West. The instruments agreed on that and disagreed on everything else, which was itself informative. A thing that the department's instruments could not classify was, by the department's own oldest rule, a thing that must be brought in quietly and studied, and if it could not be studied, contained, and if it could not be contained, ended, because the one unforgivable sin in the windowless heart of the ministry was to allow a power to exist in the world that the department did not understand. "It has a location," said the young unspeakable at Croker's elbow, reading the ninth mark. "The levels under the Tor. It has been broadcasting for 3 days, and it has just in the last hour acquired a second signature, colder, rising. 2 powers now, sir, where there was one, and the second one is climbing." "Then we have less time than we thought," Croker said, "and more than one thing to catch." He turned from the screaming nameless instrument and began to walk toward the lifts, and the young unspeakable fell into step, and the calm arithmetic went on behind Croker's still gray face, the arithmetic that had kept the incalculable in its boxes for 30 years and would, he intended, keep it there now. Assemble a retrieval team. Quietly. No orators, no prophet, no minister. The minister would want to make a speech, and one does not make speeches at a thing one does not understand. We go to the moor, we identify both signatures, and we bring them into the department where they can do no harm. If the first power is attached to an object, we take the object if it is attached to a person. He paused at the lift and pressed the button, and the calm did not waver because in 30 years it never had. Then we take the person. The department has taken people before when the alternative was worse. See that the team understands that it may come to that, and see that they understand it is not to be spoken of afterward, and let us go and put the oldest magic in Britain safely in a box before someone with less discipline than ourselves gets there first. The young unspeakable hesitated, which in the department was itself a small act of courage. "And if the person is a child, sir?" "The second signature is climbing, but the first, the great one, the instruments keep pairing it with something very quiet at the center. Small, it reads, if I did not know better, like a child." Croker did not slow and did not look at him, and answered in the same still gray voice with which he answered everything, because 30 years of standing between the world and the incalculable had worn all the give out of him and left only the rule. "The department has taken children before. Once. It is in the sealed ledger, and you have not read it, and you will not, and I have, and I will tell you only this, so that you carry it the way I carry it. It was the correct decision, and it was monstrous, and both of those are true at once and always will be, and that is the whole of what it costs to work in this place. We do not have the luxury of the choice between clean hands and a safe world. We chose the safe world when we took the oath, and we pay for it in the other coin, and we do not complain because there is no one to complain to who has not made the same trade." He reached the lift. "Pray it is an object. Pray with whatever you have left after this department, but assemble the team as though it is a child, because hope is not a plan, and a plan is the only prayer this office answers." The lift closed on the 2 gray figures and fell, and far above them and far to the west the sun went down at last behind the Tor, and the moor breathed out its evening mist over the drowned country, and the black mere lay under the alders keeping its 2 great secrets, the light and the cold, while toward it through the gathering dark came a kind old man who would ask before he took, and a precise gray man who would not ask at all, and a company of gray figures who took as a matter of policy. And none of them, not one, knew about the coin of black metal in the pocket of a 7-year-old, or the covenant 900 years deep, or the plain fact, so obvious that all their cleverness had walked straight past it, that the child at the center of everything had spent his entire life being wanted by people who did not love him, and had become, in the process, the single hardest thing to take in the whole of England. Chapter 4 and Chapter 5. The Forgotten Art School, as Morwen had promised, began, and it was nothing like the grey school in Little Winging where Harry had spent 3 years being careful never to do better than Dudley. It began at first light, and it happened at the water on the days the Dursleys could spare him, which turned out to be most days, because Vernon was gone to his failing depot before the dew was off the grass, and Petunia had discovered that a boy sent out early was a boy not underfoot. So Harry rose in the box room while the house still slept and went over the sagging gate and down the drove through the wet, and the moor was his, and the old arts came to him the way water comes to a dry field, everywhere at once and faster than anyone had planned for. Morwen taught him the naming first, because the naming, she said, was the root of the whole of it, and everything else was only the naming applied. "The old magic isn't spells," she told him, sitting on her stick at the lip of the black mere with the mist standing on the water and the alders leaning in. "A spell is a thing you say at the world to make it do what it wouldn't. We don't say things at the world. We say the world's own name back to it, the true one, the one it's forgotten it has, and the world remembers itself, and a thing that remembers what it truly is will do of its own accord what no spell could force it to. That's the whole secret, child, and it's why they burned us out of the books, the Wandan Latin folk, because they could never learn it, because to say a thing's true name you have to love it enough to have listened, and they were always too busy commanding to listen. She put her old brown hand flat on the turf. This is not grass, that's the name it answers to at market. Listen to it, what is it really? And Harry listened in the manner he had learned at doors, the manner he had learned for hearing the thing under the speech, and he found that if he stopped trying to hear a word and only let the green cool aliveness of the turf come up into his palm, there was a name in it after all, not a word he could have spelled, a name that was the whole of what it was to be low and green and trodden and patient, and to come back every spring no matter how hard the winter or the boot. When he had it, when he held the turf's own patient name in his mind and said it back silently, in the manner you might say a frightened animal's name to gentle it, the grass under his hand stood up. Not much, a hand's breadth of it, greener and taller and more itself than the grass around, remembering, for one bright moment, exactly what it was. And Harry, kneeling on the moor at first light, laughed the quiet laugh he kept so as not to be heard, except that here there was no one to hide from, and he let it out, and it startled a moorhen a rhyne away, and Morwen watched him and said nothing, because there are moments a keeper does not spoil. He learned the calling next, and it came easier to him than it had any right to, because he had done it already that first day, without knowing it was a thing. Morwen could lift her apple of water, and it cost her a night's ache in the shoulder. Harry could lift a fist of the mere on the second morning and a rope of it on the third, and on the fourth he stood at the edge of the black water and called it up into a slow-turning wheel, a cartwheel of the mere standing on its rim in the still air, shining, revolving, obeying the wanting with that Morwen had never learned and could only watch. It did not tire him. That was the thing that made the old woman go quiet and thoughtful on the fourth morning. The working that emptied her for a day left Harry brighter than before, fed rather than drained, because he did not push against the water and lose himself in the pushing. He agreed with it, and the agreement ran both ways, and the water gave him back as much as he spent and a little over. "You're not spending yourself," she said, watching the wheel of water turn. "That's what none of them could ever do. A wizard spends himself to work his magic, burns his own oil, and when the oil's gone he's done. You're not burning anything. You're borrowing off the water and paying it back with interest, and the water's glad of the traffic, for it's been still 900 years and a still thing wants to move. That's the old way, that's the way that doesn't end. It's why Imrais held the isle open a whole lifetime and never wore out. He wasn't holding it up by main strength, he was in agreement with it, and agreement doesn't tire the way lifting does." She shook her head slow. "I taught you the door of it. You've walked through into rooms I never saw. That's as it should be, and it sits ill with me, and I'll not pretend otherwise, for a child who can do this and doesn't yet know his own edges is a child who could drown a county by wanting too hard on a bad day, and you've bad days coming." Harry let the wheel of water sink back into the mirror and turned that over, first fact first. "Then teach me the stopping," he said, "not just the doing. If I could drown a county by wanting too hard, then the most important art isn't the calling, it's the not calling. The holding quiet, that's the one I need most, and it's the one you keep leaving till last." He looked at her, 7 years old and entirely serious. "You leave it till last because it's hard and you want me to enjoy the easy ones first. But I don't need to enjoy anything. I need to be safe to be near. Teach me the stopping today." Morwen was quiet a moment, and what moved in her old face was not to be spoken of. The private ache of a woman watching a child be wise about the wrong things, wise about danger and safety and being a menace to the people near him, when a boy of 7 ought to be wise about nothing worse than where the best conquers fell. But she did not argue because he was right, and a keeper who argues with a true thing to shield a child from growing up too fast only teaches the child that the truth can be haggled down. "Aye," she said, "today the stopping. It's the hardest of all the arts, and you're right that you need it first, and shame on the world that made a 7-year-old know it." And she taught him the holding quiet, which was not the absence of the calling but its mastery, the art of standing in the middle of a wanting so huge it could crack the moor, and keeping the gap closed to exactly the width you chose and not a hair wider. It was the only art that made Harry sweat, the only one that cost him, because it was the art of wanting with and refusing to act at once, holding the agreement open and the door shut together. By noon he could do it for the space of a breath, and by the third day for the space of a minute, and Morwen said that was further than most keepers got in a lifetime, and did not say aloud the thing behind her eyes, which was that a minute might not be long enough for what was coming. Between the great arts she taught him the homely ones, because a keeper's craft was mostly homely, and a boy who scorned the small workings would come to grief in the large. She taught him to read the moor the way she read her knee, to feel a change of weather 2 days off in the set of the reeds and the temper of the midges, to know by the color of the Rhine water whether the tide was pushing up the rivers from the far sea, to tell an alder from a willow in the dark by the smell of the bark, and to know which you might cut and which you must ask first. She taught him to lay a hearth charm that kept bread from going stale and milk from turning, and to sain a threshold against the small ill-wishing that drifts about any house, and to whistle up a breeze on a dead-still day, only a little one, only enough to turn a windmill or cool a fevered forehead. None of it was grand. All of it was old, and Harry took it in the way he took everything, greedily and exactly, and found that the homely art steadied him where the great ones left him trembling, because a boy who can keep the milk sweet feels, in some deep and childish place, that he is a person the world can rely on, and Harry had never once in 7 years been allowed to feel that, and he found he wanted it more than he wanted the green fire. On the days the Dursleys could not spare him, Harry practiced in secret, in the one place no one thought to look at him, which was the middle of his own ordinary life. This was harder than the mere, and in its way it taught him more. At the mere he could let the wanting run wide and the whole more answer. In the box room, with Petunia's tread on the stair and Dudley's television shaking the thin wall, he had to keep the gap between himself and the world shut to a crack, and work the old art so small and so quiet that a fly would not have noticed, and it was the holding quiet all over again, dressed as ordinary life. He learned to warm the tap by a single degree and no more. He learned to call one bead of water up off a wet plate, and hold it spinning on his fingertip below the level of the sink where Petunia, drying beside him, would not see, and to let it fall the instant her head began to turn. He learned to make himself, when Dudley came looking for sport, not invisible, which the old magic could not quite manage, but uninteresting, to lay the barest breath of the fog calling over his own corner of a room, so that Dudley's eye slid past him toward the biscuit tin, and Harry understood doing it that he had been doing a clumsy, handless version of this his whole life, that being overlooked was the first magic he had ever worked, and the more had only given a name to it. And in the ordinary house, in the ordinary cruelty, something turned over in him that the mere had started and the box room finished. He had spent 7 years believing that the smallness the Dursleys made him carry was the true measure of him, the real size, and everything else a story he told himself in the dark. Now he had a moor full of water that stood up when he named it, and a goblin's coin in a clean place where no fox would look, and 1,000 years folded up his sleeve, and when Vernon called him worthless across the good table one supper, the word did not land where it used to land. It slid off the way Dudley's eye slid off the overlooked corner, and Harry sat with his bread and understood quietly that the Dursleys had never once known who was sitting in their box room, and never would, and that this ignorance, which had been the whole grief of his childhood, was now the safest wall he owned. They could not take what they could not see. They had trained him, without meaning to, in the one art that would keep the rest of the arts secret. He very nearly thanked them for it, and then remembered that thanking Aunt Petunia for anything only made her suspicious, and ate his bread instead, and kept his enormous secret behind his boring face, and was in the small hours in the small room something close to happy, which was the single strangest thing that had happened to him all summer, stranger than the water and the woman and the goblin, that a caged childhood could turn under a far green hill into the perfect hiding place for a wonder. It was not all wonder, and he would not have wanted it told that way. There was a wet gray afternoon the Dursleys kept him in, and Dudley, bored past bearing, cornered him on the landing and drove a fist into his arm out of nothing but the old habit of it, and Harry, who could have called the green fir and grown a briar out of the carpet to swallow his cousin whole, did nothing at all, took the blow and folded down small the way he had always folded, because a briar in the carpet would have brought the whole house down on the secret, and the secret was worth more than his arm. He sat in the box room afterward with the bruise coming up purple, and turned the wand over in the dark, and felt the want in him to have used it, the enormous simple want, and set it down, and did not use it, and understood that this too was the holding quiet, the hardest art, worked now not on a mirror but on his own heart. And there was a worse afternoon, and a quieter one, when he watched through the net curtains a boy from a nearby farm ride past on a bicycle with 2 other boys, the 3 of them shouting nothing to each other, happy over nothing, and Harry stood at the glass with 1,000 years up his sleeve and wanted, with a plain and childish ache that no old art could touch, to be one of 3 boys shouting nothing, and could not and never had been, and knew now that he never would be. Because a child who has drawn Merlin's staff from the water does not get to go back and be ordinary, and the price of the wonder was that particular door, closed now for good, the small bright door of an unremarkable life. He let himself stand at the glass and want it for exactly as long as it took the bicycles to pass. Then he drew the curtain and went back to his practicing, because the moor was waiting, and the moor, whatever else it was, had never once made him feel like a boy watching other boys through glass. On the 5th day the staff began to teach him itself, and that was a different order of thing entirely. It happened at the mere in the grey before dawn, when Harry had come early and Morwen had not yet risen, and he sat alone at the lip of the black water with the wand across his knees, tired, the good tired of learning, and he laid his hand flat along the wand in the manner he laid it on the turf, and without meaning to he listened to it for its own name. and the staff, which had waited 1,000 years to be listened to like that, opened. It did not show him a vision this time, or not only a vision. It ran the forgotten arts up his arm one after another as the letters ran up its shaft, not as pictures but as knowings, each one arriving whole and settling into the empty places in him that had been waiting his whole life to be filled. He learned the mist calling, the drawing up of the standing fog the isle had used for its walls, the fog that hid a thing not by covering it but by folding the ways to it, so that a traveler walked toward it forever and never arrived. He learned the green fire, which was not fire at all but the calling forth of the living green so fiercely and so fast that it burned, that a thicket could be summoned out of bare ground in a heartbeat, and a naked hillside made a forest between one breath and the next, the isle's old defense, the reason no army had ever taken Avalon by land, because the land itself rose green and swallowed them. He learned to call true names not only from grass and water, but from the deep stones that remembered being mountains and the mist that remembered being sea. And between the knowings, as a man teaching a craft will pause to show the apprentice why the craft is worth the learning, the staff opened its long memory and let Harry stand, for whole minutes that were also no time at all, inside the life of the one who had carried it before him. He saw him rise as a young man on the shining isle, not the gray sleeper of the first vision but the maker in his strength, walking the terraced orchards with the staff still a living blackthorn in his hand, teaching the water to stand up into walls and the mist to fold the roads, holding the seam in the world open with nothing but agreement and love, and a patience that made Harry's whole summer of learning look like a single indrawn breath. He saw that Imrise had been lonely too, lonely in the particular way of a person who can do what no one else can do, set apart by his own gift the way Harry had always been set apart by his own strangeness, and that the isle had been, among all the other things it was, the place a lonely maker built so that there would be one country in the world where he was not strange, where the water answered and the trees remembered and nothing looked at him and found him wrong. And Harry, kneeling at the black mirror in the gray dawn with 1,000 years pouring up his arm, understood the deepest thing the staff had to teach him, which was not an art at all but a kinship. That the greatest wizard of the old world had been a child once who did not fit, and had grown up not by learning to fit but by making a place where fitting was beside the point, and that this, more than the mist calling or the green fire or the terrible naming of the dead, was the true inheritance, the thing the blood had carried down all the scattered generations to lay at last in the hand of another lonely child who did not fit. "You are not strange," the staff said to him without words in the oldest and kindest of all its meanings. "You were only born 1,000 years from home. I have come to take you back." And he learned, last, held back by the staff as a thing not to be given to a child except that the child would need it, the naming of the dead. For the dead have true names too, the staff taught him in the gray silence, and a true name is a summons and a binding both, and the oldest and most terrible of all the forgotten arts is the speaking of a true name to a thing that has died and not departed, because such a name will call it and hold it and command it. There was a reason Imrise had used this art exactly once in his long gentle life and had wept, they said, before it and after, because to name the dead is to hold power over the one thing that should be past all power, and the holding of it marks the one who holds always and never for the better. The staff taught Harry the shape of the art without teaching him its use, in the manner you might show a child where a knife is kept and how it opens without once letting the child cut. And Harry understood, receiving it, that the staff itself misliked this teaching, misliked what it was showing him, and was showing him anyway, because somewhere under the moor a dead thing that had not departed was learning to stand, and only a namer of the dead could lay it back down, and there was no one else in all the wide world, and the child at the mirror was 7. He came up out of the deep of the staff's teaching to find the sun risen and Morwen standing over him with her stick, her white sky-colored eyes stretched wide, because the mist had risen around the mirror while he sat, thick and standing and folded, the isle's own walls, called up by a sleeping boy who did not know he called them. And inside the ring of fog the black water had gone bright, lit from below, red and gold, nearer to waking than it had been since the day he drew the staff. "Child," said Morwen, and her voice was not steady. "Child, what have you called?" "Didn't call anything," Harry said, and then looked at the standing mist and the lit water and knew that he had in his sleep, in his tiredness, called half the old arts at once without a single word, and knew too what had drained the color from the old woman, which was not the mist or the water but what they meant, that he was past her now, past the door and the rooms and the whole of what she could teach or hold, out in the deep country of the magic where she could follow only with her eyes. He let the mist go. It cost him nothing, he had only to stop agreeing with it, and it thinned and sank, and the ordinary moor came back, and the water dimmed, and the moorhens took up their arguments, and Morwen lowered herself onto her stick as though her legs had emptied, and pressed one old hand to her mouth, and for once had nothing at all to say. It was that same afternoon that the cold came. They felt it first as a wrongness in the light. The day had been high and hot, an ordinary blazing July over the levels, and then, between one moment and the next, without a cloud, the light went thin, the way light goes thin in the hour before thunder, except that there was no thunder, no cloud, no wind, only the sun gone suddenly wan and far, as though something had come between the moor and the warmth of the world. The dragonflies dropped out of the air. The green went gray at its edges. And from the direction of the mere, up out of the alders, rolled a cold that was not the cold of weather, but the cold of deep water and old graves, the cold the wand kept for danger, the cold of the mere itself given a will and a direction, coming up the drove toward the keeper's cottage like a tide filling a Rhine. "It's him," Morwen said, very low, and her old hand closed hard on Harry's wrist. He had never heard her sound like this, flat and small, all the creek pressed out of her, and he understood that this was the thing she had gone blank about on the very first day, the thing under the water put down not to sleep but to be kept. The drowned king. He felt the water loose long enough to gather himself, and he's found the strength to reach up out of it. Not his body, not yet, the lid still holds, his cold, his will. The front edge of him reaching up to see what woke him and whether it's strong enough to be feared. Her grip shook. Into the cottage, iron on the door, salt on the sill, the old defenses. They'll not stop him, they'll slow him, and slow is all a keeper's ever had. But Harry did not go into the cottage. He stood in the wan light with the cold rolling up the drove and the wand warm along his arm, warm and steady and awake, and he did the thing he had done the whole of his life, which was to look very carefully at what frightened everyone else and ask what it actually was, first fact first, before he let the dread do his thinking for him. "It's not attacking," he said. "Feel it, it isn't coming for us, it's coming to look. You said it yourself, it's reaching up to see what woke it, so it's not a fist. It's an eye, and an eye can be met." He worked his wrist gently out of her hand, and she made a sound behind him, and he walked a few steps down the drove toward the rolling cold into it, and stood in the gray wrongness while it broke over him like the mere closing its window over a drowning thing. He was afraid. He let himself have the word for it once, standing there, because it was the truest thing in him, and pretending otherwise would have been a lie the drowned king could taste. He was afraid the way you are afraid of the deep end before you can swim, a fear with no bottom to it. But he had spent 7 years being looked at by things that wished him harm, and he had learned the one trick that answered, which was not to look away, because looking away is how you tell a bigger creature that you already know you are prey. So Harry stood in the drove and let the drowned king's cold eye fall on him and did not drop his gaze, and he reached down, not with his hand but with the wanting with, into the front edge of the cold, and he did the smallest and least likely thing, which was to speak to it, silently in the naming voice, not a command and not a challenge, only the plain truth. "I know what you are. You are the one who was drowned for wanting to own the light. I am the one who let the water loose, and I am sorry for waking you into more of your grief, and I am not going to give you what you want. Not the light and not the leash, not to you and not to anyone, not ever. You may as well know it now, while you are only an eye before you are a fist." The cold stopped. It hung in the drove, the whole rolling tide of it, stopped and considering, and Harry felt it consider him, felt the ancient drowned attention weigh the child who had walked into it and spoken to it plainly, and for one endless moment the balance of the whole summer stood on what a thing 1,000 years dead would make of a boy who would not look away. Then the cold drew back. "Not beaten, nothing so simple." It drew back the way a wave draws back to gather itself, slow, reluctant, promising return, and the sun came thick and hot again over the levels, and the dragonflies climbed up out of the grass, and the green went green, and Harry stood in the ordinary blazing afternoon shaking so hard that he had to sit down where he was in the dust of the drove, and Morwen came to him, old as she was, and knelt in the dust and gathered him in, and he let her. And for a little while he was 7 and only 7 and did not have to be anything else. "You mad, brave, terrible child," she said into his hair, and her voice was wet. "You walked into it. You walked into the drowned king and told him you were sorry. Nobody in the whole history of the world has said sorry to that thing. It has had 1,000 years of nothing but hunger and being feared, and a scrap of a boy comes down my drove and tells it he's sorry, it's grieving." She held him back at arm's length and searched his face, and what was in hers was fierce and proud and broken all at once. "It stopped for you, it stopped to think. It has never once stopped to think in all its existence. It doesn't own thinking, it owns only wanting, and you handed it a thing to think about, and that's bought us days maybe, and it's the most dangerous gift you could have made it, because now it knows you're not only the hand that woke it, you're a will that stands against it. And a thing like that would sooner be understood by an enemy than feared by a slave. You've made it curious about you. God help the pair of us, you've made the oldest hate in England curious about a little boy." They sat together in the drove until the shaking left him, the old woman and the child, and the moor went ordinary and gold around them, and Harry worked the whole thing out loud, because saying it in order was how he made a huge thing small enough to carry. "It's going to keep coming," he said. "Isn't it? It reached up today as an eye. Next time it'll reach further, because the water's still loose and getting looser, and every day it's stronger and the lid's weaker, and one day it won't be an eye, it'll be all of him, standing up out of the mere with the whole weight of Avalon slid off his back. and when that day comes, there's only two things that happen. Either somebody puts the water back over him, which nobody can, because I let it loose and it doesn't want to go back and there's no unlacing a thing that old, or somebody lays him down again by hand, names him, names the dead thing and sends it back to sleep. He looked at the wand. That's why the staff taught me the naming of the dead this morning, even though it hated to, because it's the only art that answers him, and I'm the only one who has it. And it costs whoever uses it, the staff said. It marks you and never for the better, and Imrais used it once in his whole life and wept. He was quiet a moment. So it comes to me, at the end, whatever else happens with the kind face and the goblins and the gray man, at the very end it's me and the drowned king and a name that'll cost me something I can't get back, and there's nobody else it can be, and I'm 7. Morwen did not lie to him. That was the whole of what made her his, that she never once in all of it made a hard thing soft to spare him. Aye, she said, it comes to you, that's the shape of it, and I'd give my old life gladly to change the shape, and I can't, none of us can. It was cut 1,000 years before you were born, and it was cut to fit your hand and no other. But hear the rest of it, for there's rest of it, and it matters. She took his chin and turned his face to hers. The gray man wants the same day you're dreading. He wants the drowned king risen, because a thing full risen can be lashed and a thing sleeping can't, and he means to be standing there in the hour the king stands up with his cold tools to put the name to him first, his name, a name of owning, to make the oldest king in England his dog. So it's a race, child, and you never knew you were running it. Whoever names the drowned king in the hour of his rising has him. If it's the gray man, England gets a new dark lord with a god on a chain. If it's you. She let go of his chin. If it's you, it's not a leash you'll lay. You don't own things. You said so to the professor, and the wand believed you, and I believe you. You'll lay him to rest, which is the harder naming and the dearer one, and it'll cost you what the staff promised, and you'll do it anyway, because you're the only one who'd rather pay than own. That's why it had to be you, not because you're strong, because you're the one who will pay the price the gray man would pocket. She got to her feet, slow on the stick. So we've a race to run and a naming to learn better than you learned it in your sleep this morning, and not long to do it in. Come tomorrow, come every day there's left, and tonight go home and be a boy, for you'll not have many more nights you can. That evening, while Harry was gone back to his net curtains and his silent supper, Mordaunt Rook came to the moor. He did not come down the drove. Rook never came the front way. He had laid out his whole philosophy to a box of tools in a narrow house, and it held here as everywhere, that while the world guarded the sunrise he would go quietly down the drain. He came across the levels in the dusk by ways no ordinary traveler would find, over the rinds on planks he seemed to know were there, through withy beds that closed behind him, precise and gray and unhurried. He did not go to the mere, which he could feel was watched and woken and dangerous. He went to the green mound of the keeper's cottage, because Mordaunt Rook had done his reading, and he knew that the shortest way to a guarded thing is very often through the one set to guard it. He knocked on Morwen's door in the last of the light, and the peat-colored cat went under the dresser, and Morwen opened the door with her blackthorn stick in her hand and knew him at once for what he was, in the manner she had known Harry for what he was, the manner a keeper knows, and her old face closed like a fist. I know you, she said, not your name, your kind, you're the cold that reads. I felt you at the edges of my moor these 3 days, going round and round it looking for the seam, and here you are at my door with your reading all done, come to ask the keeper the question the books wouldn't answer. She did not step back to let him pass. Ask it then and be told no, and get off my moor before the water takes notice of you, for the water's awake now, and it likes the smell of you no better than I do. You mistake me, said Rook in his dry, precise voice, and he did not try the door, because Rook never forced a lock he could open another way. I have not come for the light. I know you guard the light, you and the child and the goblins and the kind old wizard in his purple. You are all so very busy guarding the light. I have come to tell you that I do not want it, so that you may stop spending your fear on me. I want the other thing, the thing beneath the light. The cold thing that came up your drove this afternoon and stopped for a child, which was, I confess, more than I looked for from it, and has made my work more interesting. His head tilted, listening, exact. I have waited 40 years for the water to loosen over the drowned king. I will have him, not free him, madam. I am no fool, and I have no ambition to be the first meal of a risen god. I will have him leashed in the moment of his waking, bound to my hand by the oldest law of names, and then, I think, the wizarding world that found me tedious will discover it has a very great deal of time for me after all. I tell you this plainly because you cannot stop me, and because I have found over 40 years that the truth unsettles people more thoroughly than any threat, and I should so like you to be unsettled, madam, so that you will make the error that frightened people make and send the child running to me or to the drowned king or anywhere at all that is away from the one place he is out of my reach, which is asleep in his bed knowing nothing. Morwen looked at him a long moment in the dusk. Then she did a thing Rook had read of in no book, because it was in no book, because it was the last weapon of a keeper who has nothing left. She laughed at him, a dry cracked keeper's laugh, and it was not brave defiance which he could have weighed, it was worse than that, it was real. "You've read everything," she said, "and understood nothing, and that's your kind to the life. You think the child's safest knowing nothing. You think knowing's the danger. You've got it backwards, you poor cold, clever creature. That child knew nothing his whole life, knew nothing and was given nothing and loved by no one, and it didn't keep him safe, it near unmade him. And then he pulled 1,000 years out of the water and somebody told him the truth about himself at last, all of it, the danger and the weight and the grief, and it didn't break him, it was the making of him. Knowing is the only thing that ever once helped that child. You come to my door to fright me into keeping him ignorant, and you can't see that ignorant is the one thing he'll never be again, because he's tasted the truth and he'd sooner die on his feet knowing than live on his knees blind, and he learned that at 7, you gray ghost, which is more than you've managed in 60. She stepped back at last, but only to shut the door. Get off my moor, and when you meet the child, for you will, mind you remember I told you first. He's the one soul in this whole business who doesn't want to take anything anywhere, and that's made him the hardest thing in England to take, and you've never in your cold life failed to take a thing you set out for, so you're going to lose, and you're going to lose to a 7-year-old, and I only pray I live to see your face in the hour you understand it. She shut the door on him. Rook stood before the green mound in the dusk without moving, because Mordaunt Rook did not feel the sting of words. He had burned that out of himself decades ago, along with the awe and the appetite. But he tilted his head and listened, and far off under the moor he felt the cold thing shift in its long unrest, and nearer across the darkening levels in a rented cottage he felt, faint and bright and impossibly strong, the sleeping presence of a child with 1,000 years up his sleeve. And Mordaunt Rook made an adjustment to his patient 40-year plan, a small correction, the kind an accountant makes when a figure comes in larger than he had entered it. The keeper is fond of the child, he said, to the dusk, to the cold under the moor, to no one at all. That is useful. Fondness is a lever, and a lever is how a small force shifts a large one. I had meant to take the drowned king and leave the light to its guardians. But the child is the pin that holds the whole lock. The keeper says so herself and does not hear that she has said it, and a careful man draws the pin before he lifts the lid. He turned his gray face west, toward the one rented window everyone had agreed the child was safe behind, and set off across the dark levels without hurry and without heat. Very well, I shall take the child first, and the lock will fall open of its own accord, and I shall not have to force a single door. He has spent his life being taken by people who did not love him. He will hardly notice one more. Across the moor, in the box room under the stairs, Harry lay awake with the wand along his arm and the drowned king's cold still in his marrow and Morwen's fierce wet weeping still in his ears, and he did not know that a gray man was crossing the dark toward him. But the wand knew. The wand had gone from warm to cold along his arm with no danger anywhere that he could see, and Harry lay still in the small square room and watched the ceiling, and understood that the days of learning were done and the days of the other thing had come, and that he was 7 and small and not alone, and that these 3 facts would have to serve because they were the whole of what he had. And the thing about Harry Potter, the thing a drowned king had stopped to weigh and a goblin had honored and a kind old wizard had failed to cage, was that the whole of what he had had always, by some arithmetic no one could account for, been exactly enough. Chapter 5 and Chapter 6. The gathering dark Mordaunt Rook came for Harry an hour before dawn, when the whole flat country was drowned in the grey nothing that is neither night nor morning, and he came, as he came at everything, from the side no one was watching. Harry woke because the wand woke him. It had gone cold in his sleep, the deep mere cold it kept for the worst of things, and it woke him not with a start but with a slow certain chill running up his arm into the base of his skull, and he lay in the box room in the grey dark with his eyes open and did not move, because moving was how you told a hunter you were awake. He listened. The house was asleep, Vernon's snore coming through 2 walls, and under the snore there was nothing, no creak of stair, no scrape of window, nothing at all, and it was the nothing that told him. A house at rest has 100 small sounds. This house had none. Something had laid a silence over it, in the manner Harry laid the overlooking fog over his own corner of a room, a working of quiet so complete that it was itself a noise to anyone who had learned to listen, and Harry had learned to listen in a cupboard, and he heard the silence coming up the stairs. He had 1 moment to choose, and he spent it well, first fact first, faster than he had ever run the sums. He could not fight in the house. A fight in the house woke the Dursleys, and waking the Dursleys put 3 ordinary people between him and a thing that would step over their bodies without slowing. He could not run down the stairs because the silence was on the stairs. So he did the 3rd thing, the thing a hunted child does, which was to become small and still and hard to hold. And while the door of the box room opened without a sound and a spare gray shape came through it, Harry's fingers were already at his own collar where the goblin's coin hung on a bootlace against his skin, and his thumb was already pressed to the raised staff on its face, and he was already thinking in the naming voice, as hard and as clear as he had ever thought anything. Into the black metal and the 900 years and the mile of London stone beneath, He's here, he's got me. Come, come now, the water is threatened, come. The coin went hot against his chest once, and Harry knew the message had gone down into the deep. And then a gray hand closed over his mouth, and a dry, precise voice spoke into his ear, without heat, without hurry, the most frightening voice he had ever heard, because it wanted nothing from him at all except that he be somewhere else. "Do not call the fog, child," said Mordaunt Rook. "I have read you. I know you can make yourself uninteresting. It is a pretty trick, and it will not work on me because I am not interested in you. I am interested in the lock you open, and one does not overlook a key one has come specifically to turn. Do not struggle either. I have no wish to harm you and every intention of doing so if you make it efficient. You are going to come with me quietly out of this ugly little house, and you are going to walk down to the water, and you are going to stand where I tell you to stand, and the oldest king in England is going to rise, and I am going to put a name on him, and none of it requires your consent, only your presence, and I have come a very long way to collect your presence." The gray hand tightened. "Your keeper told you I have never failed to take a thing I set out for. She meant it as a warning to you. She should have kept it for herself," and Rook took him. It was done with a cold economy that left no room for the greenfare or the calling or any of the great loud arts. Rook bound Harry's wrists with the coil of knotrope that drank magic the way blotting paper drinks ink, so that the wand along his arm went dull and far, and Harry could not reach the water through it, could reach nothing, was for a moment only a 7-year-old in the hands of a grown man who meant him no good. Rook carried him down through the silenced house, past the door behind which Vernon snored on, out into the gray drowned dawn, and set him on his feet in the wet garden, and marched him toward the sagging gate with one hand knotted in his collar. And Harry went because there was nothing else to do that would not cost more than it bought, and he did the one thing left to him, which was to keep his head and count Rook's habits, count the paces to the mere, count the minutes since the coin went hot, and wait for the sum to come out in his favor, because his whole life had taught him that the sum eventually did, if you lived long enough to reach it. He tested Rook once in the garden to learn the shape of him. It was a small test, the kind Harry had run 1,000 times on Uncle Vernon to learn where the edges of a temper lay. He let his knees fold, let himself go heavy and boneless in the grip, became a dead weight on the hand knotted in his collar, because a captor who has to carry you is a captor whose hands are full, and full hands drop things, and a dropped thing can run. Rook did not carry him. Rook did not so much as break stride. He simply closed his cold fingers a fraction tighter and spoke without looking down, in the dry voice that read everything. "You are testing whether I will pick you up. I will not. If your legs stop working, I will drag you by the collar through the nettles and the Rhine mud, and you will arrive at the water bruised and filthy and no less present, and presence is all I require. I have read every trick a frightened clever child owns, boy, because I was one, a very long time ago, in a house not unlike yours, and I learned every one of them before I learned to stop needing them. You will not surprise me with your fear. There is nothing in it I have not felt and burned out and catalogued." And Harry, hanging from his own collar with his clever test dead in his hands, understood a thing that chilled him worse than the wand's cold, that Rook was not a monster who had never been small. Rook was a monster who had been exactly as small as Harry once, and cowed in exactly the same house-shaped way, and had decided, somewhere back of the 40 years, to answer being small by becoming a thing that could never be made small again, whatever it cost, whoever it cost. He put his legs back under himself and walked. He had learned what he needed. He had learned that he and the gray man were made of the same clay and fired in the same kind of oven, and that the whole difference between them, the entire difference, was that Harry had been given at the very last a moor and a keeper and a staff that said you are not wrong, and Rook had been given nothing and had built himself out of the nothing, and that this was the saddest and the most dangerous thing Harry had ever met, and that he must not, whatever happened at the water, let the pity make him slow. The house did not stay quiet behind him. Harry had reckoned it would, and it did not, and the reason was Morwen. She had not slept either. A keeper feels a thing come onto her more in the dark as surely as she feels rain in her knee, and Morwen had felt the cold that reeds cross the levels at the black hour and go, not to the mere, but to the rented cottage where the child slept, and she had done the only thing an old woman with a blackthorn stick and no power left could do, which was to come on her old legs through the dark, too slow and too late, and coming anyway. Because that is what keepers are for, and she had been one all her life without once being needed, and would not fail the 1 hour that needed her. She came over the sagging gate as Rook marched Harry through it, and she planted her stick in the wet grass and stood in his path in her dead husband's coat with her white hair loose about her, and she did not beg. "You'll not take that child down my drove," she said, "not past me. I'm the keeper of the ninefold, and this is my ground, and you've no leave to cross it, cold man, and the old ground knows its keeper, and it will not make your walking easy." Rook stopped. He looked at her with his mild gray attention, the accountant finding a figure he had already entered. "You have no power, madam," he said. "I read you at your door. You are the last thin end of a broken line, all-knowing and no craft. You cannot stop a child being walked across a field." "No," Morwen agreed. "I can't." I never could, but I can make you spend a minute telling me so, and I can make you go round me, for I'll not step aside, and I can keep you talking while the sun climbs and the goblins come, and a keeper's whole art, reader, was never power. It was time. We buy time. We've bought 1,000 years of it a minute at a time, and I've one more minute in me, and here it is. And she stood, an old woman in a dead man's coat, in the path of the coldest man in England, and would not move. And Rook, who could have struck her down and did not, because striking down an unarmed old woman is inefficient, and Rook was never anything but efficient, went round her, which cost him the minute she had promised to sell. And Harry, dragged past, met her pale sky-colored eyes for one instant, and saw in them no fear at all, only a fierce old love and a message, plain as speech. I bought you what I could, now buy yourself the rest. They came down through the withy beds in the rising grey, Rook unhurried, Harry stumbling, Morwen following on her slow old legs behind, and ahead the far hill stood black against the sky going pale, and the drove ran down toward the alders and the black mere and the thing waking under it. And halfway there, where the drove crossed a rhine on 2 boards and a nail, the deep folk were waiting. They had come up out of the ground. There was no other way they could have come so fast. The mile of London stone and the 60 miles between had been crossed by roads that goblins kept and men did not know. And Nagrok stood on the far side of the plank bridge in his mail that had never seen the sun, with 6 of the escort ranged behind him, and his iron face turned to Rook and the child in Rook's grip. The low-held note of the covenant hummed up out of the ground and stood in the grey air, and the loremaster of the deep account spoke in a voice like a vault door opening. "Set the heir of him rise down," said Nagrok, "or answer to the deep law for laying a hand on a thing under covenant." The child called, "We came. That is the whole of the bargain and the whole of your danger, reader of cold books. You have as long as it takes me to finish speaking to take your hand from his collar." Rook did not let go. He stopped on the drove in the grey, and he tilted his precise head and studied the goblins with the mild attention of a man examining a sum that has come out slightly wrong, and when he spoke it was without fear, which was the measure of how far outside the ordinary run of men Mordaunt Rook had walked. "The covenant of the ninefold," he said. "Yes, I have read it, both rings. The deep folk hold the right of first reckoning with the blood of Imrise, and undertake to come by the coin as far as the law allows if the water is threatened. As far as the law allows, Loremaster, I have read the law too. It is a covenant of reckoning and protection. It is not a covenant of war. You may stand between me and the child. You may not strike a blow that is not first struck at you, for the deep folk do not spend goblin blood on a quarrel that is not a debt. It is written in your own oldest law, and you cannot unwrite it standing on a plank bridge at dawn. So we are at an impasse, you and I, exactly as the men who wrote your covenant intended, for they were wise, and they knew that a law which permits war permits the strong to eat the weak, and they made you keepers of a peace, not soldiers of a cause." He drew Harry a step closer to the mere, past the goblin's reach, and the goblins moved level with him, held unable by their own sacred law to close. "I will walk to the water. You will walk beside me, forbidden to touch me, honoring your covenant to the letter, which is the only way a goblin knows how to honor anything. And the child will open the lock, and the king will rise, and there is nothing in your law that lets you prevent it, because your law was written to keep a peace, and what comes up out of that water was never at peace and never will be." For the length of one held note the loremaster did not answer, and Harry, cold and bound and stumbling between a grey man and a wall of iron, understood with a sinking certainty that Rook was right, that he had read the covenant better than the goblins had lived it, that the law which protected Harry also chained the only creatures able to save him. And then Nagrok did a thing Harry would remember all his life, because it was the first time he saw that the letter of a law and the heart of it are not always the same, and that some creatures will die for the difference. "You have read the law," Nagrok said, "and I have kept it, which is a deeper knowing than reading, and I will tell you the part your books left out, cold man, because it was never written down, because it did not need to be, because only a goblin could understand it, and only a goblin was ever meant to. The covenant forbids the deep folk to make war for a cause. It does not forbid a single goblin to pay a debt with his own body. The child gave the deep folk freely in his first hour the naming we were denied 1,000 years. That is a debt. It stands in my own account, loremaster to heir, not nation to blood, and a personal debt may be paid in any coin the debtor owns, including the last coin, and I own it, and I will spend it, and the law is kept, for it is not war. It is only an old goblin settling his books." He drew from his mail a blade of goblin silver, and the 6 of the escort drew with him, and the covenant note rose to a hum that shook the dew off the reeds. "You said we may not strike a blow that is not struck first at us. Then I give you the striking of it, reader, freely, the way the child gave us the naming. Strike me. I am in your way, and I will not move, and every second you spend cutting a goblin off this bridge is a second the sun climbs and the others come. Your impasse was with the nation. Your quarrel now is with one old goblin who has chosen to be expensive." Rook weighed it. Harry felt the grip tighten at his collar, felt Rook set the seconds against the climbing sun, and Harry understood that Nagrok had changed the whole arithmetic, had made himself and his six into a wall Rook could cross only by spending the one thing he could not spare, which was time, and that the goblin was spending his own life to buy Harry minutes, and that somewhere in the gray, a great many other things were now racing toward the moor through the gap the goblins were tearing in Rook's careful plan. Harry, standing bound between them while the two old powers of the island measured each other over his head, understood for the first time what the loremaster had told him a lifetime ago in a warm cottage, that a goblin ally does not love you and does not pity you and will not fail you, and that this is worth more than love. Nagrok did not look at Harry. He had not looked at him once since the bridge. A goblin settling an account does not sentimentalize the debtor. He looked only at Rook and held his goblin silver, and stood on the plank over the black Rhine with his six behind him, and offered his own death as calmly as he had offered a coin across a scrubbed table, and Harry saw, watching him, that there are kinds of steadiness in the world that have nothing to do with warmth, that a creature can care for you exactly nothing and still stand between you and the dark until it is cut down, purely because a line in an old ledger says it must. And that this cold, faithful thing, this keeping of the account past the point of death, was its own kind of love after all, the kind that does not need to feel anything to be relied upon, and might in the end be the more trustworthy for it. He would remember the loremaster's iron profile against the graying dawn longer than he remembered a great many warmer faces. It was the face of a thing that had decided, and a thing that has decided is worth more in a bad hour than 1,000 things that merely feel. For the others had felt it too. Far to the north, in the round office, the failing silver instrument had shattered in Albus Dumbledore's hands an hour before, and the old wizard had not stopped to sweep the glass. He was already gone, already a crack of displaced air over a dozen counties, already resolving out of nothing at the edge of the sleeping levels with his half-moon spectacles and his terrible mild face and his heart doing the one thing it had sworn to do, which was to come, because he had promised the child he would always come, and Albus Dumbledore had broken every promise in his long life except that one. And under London, in the windowless heart of the ministry, Saul Croker's nameless instrument had gone past its 9th mark and off its scale entirely, and the grey unspeakables had risen as one and taken their portkeys and their nets of containment and gone west. They came onto the moor at the wrong end, a full mile from the mere, spilling out of nothing in their grey robes with their instruments screaming and their sealed orders, and no earthly idea that they were the third predator to a kill that was about to become something none of them could box. Croker took one look at the black hollow of the mere a mile off, where the sky had begun to do a thing the sky does not do, and understood two facts in the same instant, and did the calm arithmetic on both. The first was that his instruments had lied, or rather had told the truth too small. This was not a power to be contained, this was a power beside which the whole department of mysteries was a child's box of tricks, and the second was that he had brought 12 unspeakables and a great deal of law to a place that was about to have no use for either. He did not turn back. 30 years of standing between the world and the incalculable had worn all the retreat out of him. He formed his people into the containment wedge that had held 100 lesser horrors, and he began to move them toward the mere at the disciplined trot of men walking into a thing they already knew they could not hold, because holding it was the oath, and the oath did not have a clause for when it was hopeless, and that, Croker had always known, was the whole terrible dignity of the grey robes. They went in anyway. They crossed the moor faster than an old man could have, and they saw, as they came, the shape of the thing they had been sent to box. The young unspeakable at Croker's shoulder read the instruments aloud in a voice that grew flatter the worse the numbers became, which was the discipline holding, and the numbers became very bad. 2 signatures at the mere, he said, one vast and rising and cold, one small and blazing and warm, and around them a third that was neither, a fold in the world torn where no fold should be. And then he stopped reading because the last instrument in his hand, the one that measured the thing the department did not name, cracked its casing and poured out a smoke the color of the light behind closed eyes, and refused, thereafter, to measure anything at all, like a thing that had looked once at what was coming up out of the water and declined, on principle, to have an opinion about it. Croker did not slow. He had seen instruments refuse before, twice in 30 years, and both times he had lost people, and both times he had gone in anyway, and he formed his grey wedge tighter and brought them down the last of the moor toward the black hollow where the sky was doing the thing the sky does not do, folding down toward the water in a slow dark wheel, and he gave the only order the oath allowed him to give, which was forward, and his people went forward. 12 grey figures walking into a dawn that had stopped being a dawn, carrying nets meant for lesser horrors, and the particular courage of civil servants who have decided to die at their posts rather than leave a thing unboxed. They would not reach the water in time to box anything. Croker knew it and went on because the going on was the whole of what the grey robes were, and a man who has spent his life containing the incalculable does not get to choose the morning it becomes uncontainable. He only gets to choose whether he is walking toward it or away when it does, and Saul Croker had made that choice 30 years ago and had never once unmade it. And so they converged, three forces on one black mirror in the gray of a July dawn, the kind old wizard alone at the top of the drove, the gray company trotting hopeless across the far moor, the cold reader with the child at the water's edge and racing all of them up out of the deep, the note of a goblin's last debt. Rook struck first. He was not a man to stand on a bridge and be delayed, and he did the sum and paid it, and it was the coldest thing Harry had yet seen him do. He did not fight next. He simply raised the iron knife with the drowned bog oak hilt and cut, once precisely not at the goblins but at the knot rope binding Harry's wrists, freeing one hand, and before Harry understood why, Rook had closed that freed hand around the wand along Harry's arm and forced it up, forced Harry's own hand and the staff of him rise toward the black water, and spoke a word of the old dark tongue into Harry's ear, a word of unlocking, a word he had bought with a man's life and rehearsed 10,000 times. The word went down Harry's arm and through the staff whether Harry willed it or not, because the staff was the pin of the lock and Harry was the hand on the pin, and Rook had made the hand his own for exactly as long as it took to turn. The mirror answered. All the folding Harry had learned came undone at once, and the black water did not rise this time in a rope or a wheel or a tree. It heaved, the whole of it, the bottomless deep of it tilting up into the gray dawn, and the false shallowness that had hidden its true depth peeled back, and where the staff had lain 1,000 years there was now an opening, a throat, a fold in the world torn wide, and up through it, cold enough to gray the reeds and freeze the running Rhines to ice in July, came the first true breath of the thing that had been drowned there and bound and kept. No longer an eye, no longer a front edge, but the whole rising will of the drowned king, gathering itself for the last long climb up out of the deep and into the standing morning. The cold of it went out across the whole of the levels in a single spreading ring, and the ordinary world, which had slept through everything, felt it and did not understand it and shrank from it in its sleep. In a dozen farmhouses milk soured in the churn and dogs woke howling with their hackles up at nothing. Along the drove the withies that Harry had grown overnight a summer ago dropped every leaf at once, blackened, as though a frost of 100 winters had walked down the lane. And in the mere itself the black water drew back from its own edges, shrinking, bearing a rim of pale drowned mud that had not seen the air since before England had a name, and out of the bared mud, where the fold gaped widest, the first of him came into the light, a hand. Only a hand at first, rising out of the throat of the water, but a hand the size of a cottage, gray-green and streaming, ringed and mailed in the black, closing slowly on the morning air as though testing whether the world was still there to be taken, and every finger of it was crowned with the weed and the small white bones of 1,000 drowned years, and the sight of that one rising hand emptied the breath out of every living thing on the moor, the goblins and the gray company and the kind old wizard and the keeper. All of them, all but the child, who had known it was coming, who had walked down to the water precisely so that he would be standing here when it did. Rook, wrestling in the knot of goblins, saw the hand and stopped wrestling, and something went across his gray, precise face that was almost joy, the joy of 40 years arriving at their answer, and he stopped trying to reach the water and simply began from where he lay pinned to speak his own name of owning, fast under his breath, racing the child because he had understood at last that this was not a fight of bodies but a race of tongues, and that whoever spoke the true name of the drowned king first, in the hour of his rising, would hold the oldest power in England, and that the hour was now and the rising was upon them, and there was time for exactly one name to be spoken before the king was too far up to be bound by any name at all. There, said Mordaunt Rook, and let Harry go, and stepped back to the water's edge with his 3 cold tools ready and his patient 40-year face at last, for one instant, almost warm. There, it comes. Now, Loremaster, spend your goblins if it pleases you, there is nothing left to guard, and you, child, stand where you are and watch. You wish to keep the great dangerous thing from everyone. You have instead delivered it with your own hand to me. Ignorance would have served you better after all. Your keeper was wrong about that, as the fond are always wrong. But Harry was not standing where Rook had left him. The instant the gray hand released his freed wrist, Harry had moved, not away from the water, which is what Rook expected, what any hunted thing does, but toward it, down to the very lip of the heaving mere, into the cold that was graying the world. Because he had done his sum in the half-second, Rook gloated, and the sum had come out, and the answer was terrible and simple. The king was rising and could not be stopped now, and the only question left was who would name him in the hour of his rising, and Rook stood ready with a name of owning, and there was one hand on the whole more faster to the water than Rook's, and it was the hand the staff had chosen, and it was already reaching. Harry. The voice came from behind him up the drove, mild and ancient and out of breath, and Harry turned his head 1 degree and saw Albus Dumbledore standing at the top of the slope in the gray with his wand in his hand, and Fawkes a red gold blaze on his shoulder, and his terrible kind face open with something almost, for once, unguarded. Harry, come away from the water. I can hold the rising. I have strength you have not dreamed of, and I will spend all of it, I swear to you on my sister's grave, but you must come away and let me stand between it and you. That is the whole of what I am for, child. Let me be the safe hands one time. Let me take this from you. You are 7 years old and you should never have had to stand there. Come away and let the old man do what old men are for." And there was no lie in it, none. It was the truest thing Dumbledore had ever said, and it was still a cage, the last and kindest and most reasonable cage of all, offered at the edge of the world with a god rising out of the water. And Harry heard both things at once, the love in the cage, exactly as Morwen had taught him, and did not let the first talk him out of the second. "You can't hold it," Harry said, not turning, his eyes on the heaving black throat of the mirror and the cold pouring up out of it. "You could hold a lot of things, not this one. This one's mine. Not because I want it, I don't. I'd give anything for it to be yours or anyone's. It's mine because it's the naming of the dead, and only the blood can do that, and you're not the blood, you're the kind face. And the kindest thing you could do right now isn't to take it from me. It's to stand behind me and catch me if I fall, because I'm going to do a thing that costs, and I would rather not do it alone, and you said you'd always come." He drew the wand up out of his dulled sleeve, and it woke in his hand, warm and blazing, free of the knot rope, brighter than all the rising cold, and the staff of Emrys unfolded to its full height in one long rush, 6 feet of pale bone-colored wood with the stone alight at its crown, taller than Harry, taller than Rook, standing up out of a 7-year-old's fist at the edge of the mirror like a mast raised against a storm. "So come and stand behind me, Professor. Both of you can watch, but the naming is mine." For one instant something crossed Albus Dumbledore's face that had not crossed it in 100 years, the look of a man who has spent his whole life being the safe hands and has just been asked by a child to be something harder, which is the hands that stand behind and do not take. And whether he would have found it in himself to be that thing, Harry never learned, because in that instant Rook moved. He moved fast, all his patience spent, lunging for the water with the iron knife and the hagstone and the word of owning on his lips, because he saw the staff blaze and understood that the child meant to name the king first, and 40 years does not stand aside for 7. But he had reckoned without the goblins, whom he had thought neutralized, and Nagrok, who had promised to be expensive, spent himself exactly then. The loremaster of the deep account threw his whole old iron body across the drove into Rook's path with the covenant note screaming and the 6 of the escort behind him. 7 goblins settling a personal debt with the last coin they owned, and the collision of them, Cold Reader and Iron Keepers, went down in a heap of struggling grey and struggling male at the very lip of the mere, and Harry heard the loremaster's voice come up out of the tangle once, hard and clear and paying its account in full. "Now, heir of Emrys, now, while I hold him, name the dead. We did not come a mile through the deep to watch you hesitate." Harry set the foot of the staff to the turf at the very lip of the mere, in the manner Emrys had set it in the first vision, and the turf under it went green in a spreading ring against all the cold, and he laid his hand along the shaft and reached down through it, not into the water this time, but into the deep beneath the water, toward the rising will, feeling for the true name of the thing that came. And it was there. It surfaced in him the way the letters surfaced on the staff, from the side, all at once. Not a word he could have spelled, a name that was the whole of what it was to have been a king, and to have wanted the light, and to have been drowned for the wanting, and to have lain 1,000 years in the black with the whole weight of a kingdom of orchards pressing down. A name so heavy with grief and cold and old wrong that the holding of it in his mind bowed Harry's thin shoulders under a weight like the mirror itself set down on them, and he understood, holding it. Exactly what the staff had warned and Emrys had wept over, that to say this name aloud would be to take all of that grief into himself, to carry 1,000 drowned years in a 7-year-old chest, and that he would not come out of the saying the same, and that there was no one else on the whole moor who could say it, and that the sum had come out at last to this. Behind him he felt rather than saw the old wizard move, not to seize him, not this time, but to stand at last where he had been asked to stand, a half-pace back into the side, wand raised, the phoenix blazing, guarding a child's back without reaching for what the child held. And he felt on his other side a hand find his shoulder, an old brown hand that had lifted an apple of water and been proud of it. Morwen come the last of the way down her own drove on her failing legs to stand at the water with her boy, because a keeper does not let the young face the deep alone. And Harry, braced between the kind hands he had refused and the fierce ones he had earned, lifted his eyes to the mirror and held the terrible name ready on his tongue and did not yet say it, because it must be said in the hour of the rising and not before, and the rising was not finished, and the worst of it was still to come. And the sun broke at last, gold and enormous, over the far green hill, and the drowned king rose. He came up out of the torn fold in the world in the manner a drowned man comes up, slow, streaming, terrible, and he was vast, far vaster than the mere that had held him, because a thing that old is not bound by the size of its grave. He rose crowned in weed and mailed in the black water itself, a shape of cold and grief, and 1,000 years of drowned hate given at last a body of mere water and morning fog, and where his shadow fell the reeds went white and the Rhine stopped running, and the July morning turned to the deep of winter. He lifted a head streaming with 1,000 years of the mere and opened 2 eyes that were holes into the cold at the bottom of the world, and he looked for the first time in an age on the living land, on the little hill going gold in the new sun, on the grey company frozen in their hopeless wedge across the far moor, on a cold grey man wrestling in a knot of goblins, on a kind old wizard standing arrested with a phoenix blazing on his shoulder. On an old woman in a dead man's coat come stumbling down the last of the drove with her stick and her loose white hair, and last and longest on a 7-year-old boy standing alone at the very lip of the mere with a blazing staff too tall for him held up in both his hands, who had walked down to the water to meet him, and who did not look away. Chapter 6 and Chapter 7. The isle beyond the mist. Two names rose toward the drowned king in the gold and terrible morning, and only one of them could reach him first, and the whole of the world that Harry had woken hung on which. Rook's name came from the ground, gasped up out of a knot of goblins, fast and low and word perfect, a name of owning polished over 40 years in a narrow house, and it was a true name. Harry could hear that it was true. Rook had done his reading and read well, and the name flew up toward the rising hand the size of a cottage, carrying on it the whole of Rook's cold, patient will, the will that had bought a book with a man's life and burned the awe out of itself and waited 4 decades to put a leash on a god. It was a name that said, "You are mine, you are a thing I own, rise and serve," and it was almost enough. It was so nearly enough that the great gray-green hand paused in the air and turned, a fraction, toward the cold gray creature that had spoken it, considering, in the manner of a starving dog that considers a hand which might hold food or might hold a chain. And Harry at the lip of the mere with the staff of Emrys blazing in his fists and Morwen's hand on one shoulder and Dumbledore's shadow at his back, understood in that half-second the last and deepest thing the whole summer had been trying to teach him, and it was not an art, and the staff had not taught it, and Morwen had only pointed at it, and it was this: that Rook would lose the race not because his name was weaker, but because his name was smaller. Rook's name reached only the king's use. It said nothing of the king himself, of the drowned lord who had wanted the light and been cast down for it, of the 1,000 years of black water and the weed in the dead hair and the grief with no bottom to it. Rook had studied the lock for 40 years and never once wondered what it felt like to be the thing behind the door, and Harry had. Harry had walked down the drove 3 days before and said sorry to it. Harry knew the one thing about the drowned king that Mordaunt Rook, for all his reading, had never troubled to learn, which was what it was. So Harry did not race a name of owning with a louder name of owning. He could not have won that race and did not try. He spoke instead the true name the staff had laid so heavy on his tongue, the whole vast grieving name of the thing itself, and he did not speak it as a command, and he did not speak it as a leash. He spoke it in the manner you say the name of someone who has been in pain a very long time and can at last be told that the pain is over. He spoke it as a laying down. The name went up out of him, and it was not louder than Rook's. It was deeper. It came from further down. It came from the place in Harry that had spent 7 years in a cupboard learning exactly what it was to be a thing nobody wanted and everybody used. And it reached the drowned king not at his use but at his wound, at the 1,000-year-old grief under the hate, and it said in the whole of that terrible name, "I know what you are. I know you wanted the light and were drowned for the wanting. I know you have lain 1,000 years in the cold with a kingdom of orchards on your chest, awake, alone, unforgiven. And I know that no one in all that time ever once came to the edge of your water and called you by your own name instead of your crime. I am calling you by it now. You are not a weapon, and you are not a monster, and you are not a lock on a door. You are a king who was wronged and who did wrong both, and it is finished. It is 1,000 years finished, and you may put it down now. You may put the whole of it down. Come and put it down and rest." Afterward Harry could never explain, to Morwen or to himself or to the 1 or 2 souls in later years he tried to tell, what it had cost to say a thing like that and mean it, all of it, down to the floor. It was not a trick and it was not a strategy, though it worked better than any strategy. It worked precisely because it was not one. To lay a grieving thing to rest you must first, for the length of the naming, grieve with it, truly, refuse none of it, and Harry had stood at the lip of the mere with the whole cold weight of the rising king bearing down on the moor, and had done the one thing that Mordaunt Rook, in 40 years of reading, had trained himself out of the capacity to do. He had let another creature's sorrow all the way into himself, undefended, and let it be as large as it truly was, and had not looked away from a single year of it. That was the naming. That was the whole art of it, that no book held because no book could hold it, because it was not knowledge but a kind of courage, the particular courage of a child who has been given so little of his own that he has never learned to be stingy with his heart. The great gray-green hand, poised in the gold air between the cold man's leash and the child's laying down, opened. It did not close on the morning to take it. It opened slowly, the weed and the small white bones falling from its fingers back into the mere, and the whole vast rising shape of the drowned king, mailed in black water and crowned in weed, halted its terrible climb up out of the deep, and turned its 2 eyes that were holes into the cold at the bottom of the world down upon the 7-year-old at the water's edge who had called it by its right name. And what passed between them then was not a thing that could be set down in words, because it happened below words, in the deep country where the naming voice lived. But Morwen, who felt it come up through the ground and into her old legs, said long afterward that in 1,000 years of keepers no living soul had ever seen what she saw in that moment, which was the oldest hate in England looking at the one creature that had offered it not fear, not a chain, not even forgiveness, which it could not have borne, but simply recognition, the plain unbearable gift of being known and named and let go. Drowned king, who had risen to take the whole of the living world for the crime of 1,000 cold years, looked at the child who had told it the grief was finished and believed him and put it down. He sank, not driven down, not bound again under a lid, nothing so violent and nothing that would ever have to be undone. He sank in the manner of a man sinking into sleep who has been kept awake by pain for longer than he can remember and is told at last in a voice he trusts that he may stop. The vast shape of him softened and bowed and folded back down into the mere, the mailed hand and the weed-crowned head and the 1,000-year grief of him pouring back down the throat of the water in a long subsidence that took the cold with it, so that as he sank the July morning came flooding back across the levels behind the retreating winter, the ice on the Rhines running to water, the blackened withies putting out, impossibly, a haze of new green, the dogs in the far farmhouses falling quiet. The dragonflies climbing up out of the wet grass into a sun that had remembered how to be warm. And as the last of him went down, the black mirror did a thing it had not done in 1,000 years and would never, Harry somehow knew, need to do again. It closed over him gently, not as a lid slammed on a prisoner, but as a coverlet drawn over a sleeper, and the water that had been the drowned king's grave for 1,000 grieving years became, in the space of one indrawn breath, only his bed. And the price came due. Harry had known it would. The staff had warned him and Morwen had warned him, and he had done the sum and walked down to the water knowing, and still there was no being ready for it, for the naming of the dead marks the one who names always and never for the better, and Harry had not laid the drowned king to rest with a leash or a blow but with recognition, and to recognize a grief truly you must take it into yourself, and Harry took it, the whole of it. 1,000 years of cold black water and a kingdom of orchards on the chest, and the particular unforgiven loneliness of a thing awake in the dark that no one will call by its name. All of it came up the true name and into the 7-year-old who had spoken it, and Harry Potter stood at the lip of the settling mirror in the gold morning, and felt 1,000 years of another creature's sorrow pour into a chest that was already, at 7, more than half full of his own. His knees went. The staff came down with him, its blaze guttering, and he folded onto the wet grass at the water's edge, with the whole weight of the drowned king's rest laid finally and forever across his own thin shoulders. It was the heaviest thing he had ever carried, heavier than the cupboard years, heavier than the name in the water, and he carried it because there was no one else to, and because a thing laid to rest must be carried by someone, and he was the someone, and had always, in some way he was only now old enough to feel, been the someone. Morwen caught him. And Dumbledore, who had stood the whole time exactly where a 7-year-old had told him to stand, a half-pace back with his wand raised and his phoenix blazing in his hands, for once in his 100 years, kept to himself, moved at last not to take anything, but to kneel in the mud of the mere bank beside an old keeper and a fallen child, and to lay one ancient hand very lightly on Harry's hair. And Fawkes came down off his shoulder in a fall of red-gold fire, and settled on the grass beside the guttering staff and sang, lo, the note it had sung the night the water woke, the note that had not been heard in Britain since the island was another island. And the Phoenix song went into Harry where the grief had gone, not taking the grief away, for Phoenix song cannot do that and would not if it could, but sitting down beside it, keeping it company, in the manner that the one kind of song can sit beside the one kind of sorrow and make it, not lighter but survivable. And Harry, flat on the grass with 1,000 years of another king's grief in his chest, and a phoenix singing at his ear, and an old woman's tears falling on his face, and a kind old wizard's hand on his hair, did the thing a 7-year-old does at the end of a thing far too large for him. He wept, not for himself. For the drowned king who had waited 1,000 years to be let go, and for the plain unfairness that letting him go had cost, and that things which are right should not cost so much, and do always, and that he was 7, and now knew it. It was the only time that summer he let himself weep where anyone could see, and he chose his witnesses without knowing he chose them, a keeper who loved him, a goblin's covenant at his throat, a phoenix, and an old man learning, too late and at last, to keep his hands to himself. There are worse companies to be broken open in front of. Harry would not, in all the long years after, ever be ashamed of that weeping, which is a rare thing to be able to say of the first time a person is broken open, and rarer still to have earned. Of Mordaunt Rook there was, at the end, very little to tell, which would have offended him more than any grander ruin, for he had wanted, above every other thing, to matter. His name of owning had reached the drowned king a half-breath after Harry's laying down, and it had found nothing there to own, because the thing it reached for had already been given the one gift that unmakes ownership, which is rest, and a name of owning spoken over a thing at peace has nowhere to land. It rebounds. Rook's 40-year polished name of owning came back down the cold he had ridden it up, back into the narrow gray channel of the creature that had spent his whole life making himself a thing that could never be owned, and it owned him. What exactly it did to him, no one on the moor could afterwards say, and Harry did not look, because he had learned from a keeper and a goblin that some things are laid down and not gloated over. When the goblins untangled themselves from the place where Rook had lain pinned, there was a coat there, and the 3 cold tools, the iron knife and the notch rope and the hold grey stone, and no more daunt Rook at all. Only a cold grey quiet where a cold grey man had been, in the manner of a thing that has at last been granted the one wish it truly held, which was never to be reached by anyone ever again. The goblins gathered up the 3 tools without a word, because tools of that make were a debt and a danger and belonged in the deep where such things are kept, and they left the coat lying on the moor. And the coat is, for all that Harry ever knew, lying there yet, greening over, a little smaller each year, keeping the shape of a man who had wanted so badly to matter that he made himself into nothing anyone could hold. He was 7 and he would carry the drowned king's grief all his life, but he never once carried Rook's, and he thought about that sometimes in the years after that of the 2 of them. The one who took griefs into himself slept better than the one who had refused to feel a single one, and that this was, perhaps, the whole difference between the 2 ways a broken child can grow. Nagrok did not die. It had been nearer than a goblin likes to admit. The cold reader had cut him twice in the tangle before the naming turned everything. And goblin silver mail is proof against most things, but a knife of drowned bog oak is not most things. And the loremaster of the deep account rose from the drove that morning with his own dark blood on the mail, and the particular expression of a creature deeply annoyed to have survived a debt he had fully intended to pay in full. Harry, when he could stand, went to him on legs that did not much want to hold him, with 1,000 years of grief still settling in his chest, and he did not thank the goblin because you do not thank a goblin, but he stood in front of him and said the true thing instead. "You spent your life for me," Harry said. "Your own, not the nation's. You told the gray man to strike you so I'd have the minute. And you lived, and I'm glad, and I'm not allowed to be grateful, but I am anyway inside where you can't charge me for it." He looked at the dark blood on the iron mail. "I don't know how to pay that back. I don't think there's a coin for it." "There is not," said Nagrok, and his voice was rough with the wound and with something under the wound. "You are correct that there is no coin, and correct not to insult me by pretending you own one. A life spent freely cannot be repaid, it can only be honored, which is a different ledger and a longer one." He looked at the child, and for the second time in their brief acquaintance something almost gentle crossed the iron of his face and was gone. "You laid 1,000 years to rest with a true name and took the price of it into your own body without flinching, which no wizard living would have done and no king of the old world did more than once. The deep folk saw it. The nation will hear it before nightfall, all of it, and the ledger of Emrise, which has stood 1,000 years half open, will be written closed tonight in the deepest vault, in letters of respect, which is a currency the deep folk spend on perhaps 3 names in an age. You have earned it, heir of Emrise. You will not understand for years what you have been given, and that is as it should be, for a gift understood too soon is a gift misspent." He inclined his head, the full inch this time, the inch a goblin gives to a creditor whose account has been paid in the 1 coin goblins hold above gold. "The covenant is kept, the reckoning is good, and you have a friend in the deep who does not love you, does not pity you, and will not fail you, and who now additionally and against every custom of my people respects you, which is rarer than the other 3 together, and worth, I think, in the final accounting rather more. Send by the coin in the years to come. We will answer further than the wizards think, and further than we would answer for gold, because gold is only gold, and what you paid this morning was not." Then the deep folk went back down into the ground the way they had come, iron and cold and unhurried, carrying their wounded loremaster and Rook's 3 tools and the whole tale of the morning down into the dark to be written into the oldest ledger in Britain, and the low note of the covenant went with them and sank into the peat, and the moor was left to the living morning and the grey company and the kind old wizard and the keeper and the child. Saul Croaker and his 11 grey unspeakables reached the mere at last, a long minute after there was anything left to contain, and stood at the edge of it in their screaming instrument silence, looking at an ordinary black pond in an ordinary wet wood, with a boy and an old woman and Albus Dumbledore kneeling on the bank. And Croaker, who had come to put the oldest magic in Britain in a box, looked at the settled water and the greening withies and the child with the 2 tall staff, and did the last and hardest sum of his 30 years. Then he did a thing that no one in the Department of Mysteries had done in living memory. He called off the containment. "And down," he told his people in his still grey voice, and when the young unspeakable began to protest that the instruments, that the signatures, that the sealed order, Croaker cut him off without heat. "The signatures are gone, read them again. There is nothing here to contain, there is only a settled water and a tired child, and the department does not box tired children, whatever the sealed ledger says, because I am the one who reads the sealed ledger, and I have decided that today it stays shut." He looked for a long moment at Harry, at the staff, at the whole impossible morning, and something moved behind the still gray face that might, in a person who had not spent 30 years burning it out of himself, have been awe. We will report that the disturbance resolved itself before our arrival, which is true, and that its cause could not be determined, which is a lie, and which I will tell and carry, because 30 years in that windowless place has taught me one thing your instruments never will, child, which is the difference between a power that must be boxed and a power that must be let alone. You are the second kind. Be the second kind all your life, and the department will never trouble you. Become the first, and we will come, and I will be sorry, and we will come anyway. He inclined his head a fraction, the salute of one keeper of dangerous things to another. Do not make us come. Then the gray company gathered up their broken instruments and their sealed orders and went, folding out of the morning the way they had folded into it, and the moor was quieter by 12, and there remained at the water's edge only the three who had been there since before the sun. The child, the keeper, and the kind face Harry had been warned of by a woman of water and a goblin of iron and an old wife on a moor, and had refused and would refuse again. Albus Dumbledore rose from the mud of the bank, an old man with a wet knee and a phoenix and 100 years of cages behind him, and he looked down at Harry, who had got himself upright with the staff for a crutch, and there was on the ancient face no anger and no scheming and no twinkle, only a plain and weary honesty that was harder to look at than any of those would have been. I came to take you, he said, you know that. I will not insult you by pretending otherwise, not after this morning, not standing here. I came west to make myself, in law and in love, the only hands you would have left to run to, and I told myself it was to save your life, and there was truth in it. There is always truth in it. That is the whole of my particular damnation. And instead I stood behind you with my hands to myself and watched a 7-year-old do a thing I could not have done and would have been wrong to try, and I understood, too late as usual, that the safest hands in the whole business were the ones that already held it, exactly as you told me on a garden wall a week ago, and that my long life of being the safe hands has been, in its deepest part, a refusal to believe that anyone else's could be. He drew a breath. I am not going to make myself your guardian, Harry. I came here meaning to. I am choosing not to, which is a thing I have not done in 40 years, chosen not to shut a door I had the power to shut, and it unsettles me more than the drowned king did, and I am doing it anyway, because you have shown me this morning that the door left open is sometimes the only door that leads anywhere at all but back into myself. You'll watch me, though, Harry said, not unkindly. He had stopped somewhere in the last hour, being able to hate the old man, which was its own kind of loss. You'll always be watching, Mrs. Figg or someone, you won't be able to help it. I will always be watching, Dumbledore agreed, because I love you in the way that the keeper of a cage loves the bird, and I am too old to unlearn it entirely, and you would be a fool to trust me the whole way, and you are not a fool. But I have made you one promise I have never broken, and I make it again here, and it is the only thing between us that will ever be worth anything. When you send for me I will come, not to take, to stand behind you if you will have me there, and to catch you if you fall, which is, I find, at the very end of a very long life, the thing that old men are actually for, and which I have spent 100 years being too clever to learn. He looked at the staff, at the stone gone quiet at its crown, and the old scholar's hunger rose in him one last time, and one last time he mastered it and let it go. Keep it. It was never mine, and it never will be, and I have wanted it, on some level, since the night the water woke, and I think the wanting of it is the last of the things I must set down before I die. It is yours, you drew it, you did not let go. Everyone in this business will spend the rest of your life telling you it is theirs to guide, or theirs to guard, or theirs to fear, and you will know, because a woman of water told you at the very beginning, that it is yours for one reason only, that your hand reached across the fold and held on. Hold on, Harry. Whatever they offer you, hold on. Then he too was gone, in a crack of displaced air and a last low note of phoenix song, back to his round office and his broken instruments and his 100-year war, a kind old man who had, for one morning on a wet moor, chosen the harder kindness over the easier control, and who would spend the rest of his long life not being entirely certain he could do it a second time. And Harry was left with Morwen at the edge of the settled water, in the ordinary gold of a July morning, and the mist rose off the mere. It rose the way it had risen the first day, in a great slow wheel, and Harry watched it climb with the last of the staff-light caught in it, and the shapes came into it again, the barges and the arch of the bridge and the orchards heavy with the fruit that had been peat 1,000 years, all of it turning up into the light. And across the settling water walked the brightness that was a woman and was not, robed in the mere so that the willows showed through her, and she came to the edge and looked down at the child and the keeper, and her drowned-bell voice was gentler than it had been on the first day, because the thing she had waited 1,000 years to see done was done. It is finished, said the lady of the mere, and it is only begun, and both of those are true, as the true things always come in pairs. You have laid the old grief to rest and taken up its weight, and Avalon is awake now, child, awake and yours, for you woke it and no other may claim it. But hear the shape of the years, for you are 7 and the shape matters. The isle will not come up out of the water into the wide grasping world. That world is not ready and may never be, and Avalon has learned the hard and drowned way what the grasping world does to a country of orchards. It will wake in secret. It will wake in you and in the water when you come to it, and in the green things that stand up under your hand, and it will wait, folded and patient and living, for the far day when its air is grown and the world is a kinder place, and that day may be yours to make, or it may fall to hand 1,000 years past yours, and either way it is not for a 7-year-old to carry today. Today you carry only this, that you are the heir of Emrise, and Avalon is awake, and the staff is yours, and the deep folk respect you, and the grief of a king sleeps quiet in your chest and always will, and that you are going now home to a cupboard and a boiled egg and an aunt who does not know who is sitting in her box room. And that this is exactly right, that the enormous should go home small, because a child who is handed the whole world too soon is a child destroyed, and the water which loves you will not do to you what the grasping world would. Will I see you again? Harry asked. He was 7 and tired past the far edge of tiredness, and it was the only question that mattered to the child in him beneath the air. When you come to the water, said the lady, you will find me in it, not this water only. All old water remembers Avalon now that Avalon is awake, and there is old water in more places than you would think, in meres and wells and the deep slow rivers, and where there is old water there is a door, and where there is a door the blood of Emrise may knock, and I, or something of me, will answer. You are not going back to being alone, child. You will look alone. You will sit in your box room and set your aunt's table and be overlooked, and you will look to the whole wide world, exactly as alone as you have always been. But you will never be alone again, because you have a keeper on a moor, and a goblin in the deep, and a woman in the water, and 1,000 years up your sleeve, and a whole isle of orchards asleep in your chest waiting for you to grow. And the difference between looking alone and being alone is the difference between a cupboard and a fold in the world, and you, of all the children who ever lived, know that difference in your bones. One thing more, said the lady, when she was already half gone back into the water, thin now, the willows showing through her. The staff will not always be a wand up your sleeve, and Avalon will not always be a secret you keep by a rented cottage. You are 7. There will come a school in the north of the wand and Latin folk, and you will go to it, because a boy must be taught the small magic before the world will let him near the large, and you will sit in their classrooms and wave their little sticks and say their little words and let them think that is the whole of what you are, and it will be the easiest hiding of your life, easier than the box room, because they will be so very certain they already know what a wizard is. And all the while the old magic will be waking under the floors of that castle, for it is built on older water than they know, and the blood of Emrise walking its halls will call to things in the deep of it that have slept as long as I slept, and you will have in the years to come a great deal of quiet work to do in a loud place, and no one to help you with the true part of it but a keeper and a goblin and a woman in the water. That is the shape of the long years. I tell it to you now once and will not weigh you with it again, so that on the gray days you will know that the water saw it coming and was not afraid, and neither in the end need you be. And she sank back into the black, the way a reflection goes when the lamp is carried from the room, and the mist came down, and the mere lay ordinary and gold under the July sun, an ordinary pond that a farmer might water his beasts at, keeping its one great sleeping secret gently and forever. Harry stayed with Morwen until the middle of the afternoon, because there was no hurry now, and because a keeper feeds people, and she fed him bread and honey by the fire in the low warm cottage with the peat-colored cat pressed against his ankle, and neither of them said very much, because the largest things do not want words and the small ones did not need them. But before he went she took his face in her 2 old brown hands and looked at him a long moment, and Harry looked back and did not flinch, because he had learned on this moor that some hands are for holding and not for hitting, which was, of everything the summer had taught him, perhaps the thing he would carry the longest and the thing he had waited the longest to learn. You'll go back to them, Morwen said, the net curtain people. And it'll be gray and small, and they'll never know, and there'll be days you'll wonder whether any of it was real, the water and the woman and the goblin and the king, whether a boy in a cupboard dreamed the whole of it, because a cupboard is a hard place to be 7 in. And on those days you take out the coin, or you find the nearest old water and put your hand in it, or you work the smallest of the arts, warm a tap, green a leaf, only to yourself, only to know. And it'll all come back, and you'll know it was real, and you'll know who you are, no matter how small the room they shut you in. That is the last thing I have to teach you, and it is the truest, and no staff could teach it, and no lady, only a keeper who has spent a whole life being overlooked and kept her own name through the middle of it. She kissed his forehead once over the thin white scar. You are Harry Potter, and you are the blood of Emrise, and you drew the staff from the water, and you laid 1,000 years to rest, and you are 7 years old, and you are loved, child, whatever house they keep you in. You are loved on a moor by an old woman who waited her whole life without ever knowing she was waiting for you. Now go home, and come back next summer. The water and I will be here. We are both of us very good at waiting. At the door the peat-colored cat, which had permitted itself to be scratched exactly once in 11 years, and had chosen Harry to permit it to, wound itself around his ankles in a figure of 8 and then sat, and looked up at him with its flat gold eyes, and Harry crouched and put his forehead down against the top of its warm head for a moment, which is a thing a boy does when he cannot say a thing out loud and needs to say it anyway, and the cat allowed it. Which Morwen said afterward was the most extraordinary magic worked on the moor all that summer, and she may not have been joking. Then he stood and shouldered the invisible weight that would be his now for good, the staff and the coin and the king's long rest, and he found that it settled more easily onto shoulders that had been carrying too much for too long already, that a back trained by 7 years of unfair loads takes up a fair one almost gladly, because at least the fair one means something. He had come to the moor a week ago able to carry only misery. He left it able to carry a kingdom. It was, when he thought about it later, the truest gift the summer gave him, worth more even than the wonder, not the power but the discovery that the strength the Dursleys had built in him by cruelty could be turned entire to something he had chosen, and that nothing that had been done to him was wasted now, because he had found, at last, a weight worth the muscle. So Harry Potter went home across the drove in the long gold afternoon, over the planked bridge and the Rhines bright with duckweed and the withies standing green again along the water, with Merlin's staff folded small up his sleeve and a goblin's coin against his chest, and 1,000-year grief sleeping quiet in a heart that had somehow, impossibly, grown large enough to hold it and still keep room. The far hills stood up out of the levels behind him, green and secret, keeping Avalon under its net of fields, and ahead the rented cottage waited with its washed step and its net curtains and its aunt who would want to know where that boy had got to. And Harry put on his boring face like a coat and climbed the sagging gate and became, between the garden and the door, a boy so unremarkable that the eye slid off him. But he was not the same boy who had climbed that gate a week before with a birthday no one had wished him. He was 7 years old, and he carried a staff and a coin and a king's rest and an Isle of Orchards and the plain unshakable knowledge, come to him at last on a drowned green moor under a hill men called Avalon, that he was known and named and wanted and loved, and that the smallest room in the meanest house on the tidiest street in all of England could not make those 4 things untrue, because he had reached across a fold in the world and held on and was holding on still and meant to go on holding. Whatever they offered him for the whole of his long and secret and extraordinary life. Chapter 7 End.